Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. It happened in the summer of 2017, when I was 23 years old. I was working a dead-end office job that was slowly draining the life out of me, and I needed an escape. My friend Ava had been suggesting for weeks that we should go camping, just the two of us, somewhere far from the city. She had always been the adventurous type, while I tended to stay close to home. But something about her enthusiasm was infectious, and after another particularly grueling week at work, I finally agreed. We spent several evenings planning the trip, poring over maps and reading reviews of different campsites. Ava wanted something remote, something that would feel like a real wilderness experience. I was hesitant about going too far from civilization, but she assured me it would be fine. We'd bring plenty of supplies, tell people where we were going, and keep our phones charged in case of emergency. What could go wrong? The campsite we settled on was about 3 hours north of our town, nestled deep within a sprawling forest that stretched for miles. The reviews online were sparse but positive. People praised its isolation and natural beauty. Only one review gave me pause. A brief comment from someone saying they'd heard strange sounds at night. But the reviewer had also mentioned they'd been drinking, so I dismissed it as probably an owl or coyote that had startled them. I had no idea how wrong I was to ignore that warning. We left on a Friday afternoon in late June. My beat-up sedan loaded with camping gear, food, and enough water for 3 days. The drive took us through gradually changing landscape, suburban sprawl giving way to small towns, then farmland, and finally dense forest. The further we drove, the more isolated I felt. Cell phone reception flickered and died about an hour before we reached our destination. When we finally turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to the campsite, the canopy overhead became so thick that it felt like driving through a tunnel. Branches scraped against the car windows, and I had to navigate carefully around potholes and exposed roots. The road seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the woods. I started to wonder if we'd made a wrong turn, but then the trees suddenly opened up into a clearing. The campsite was exactly as described, a roughly circular area of flattened grass, surrounded on all sides by towering pines and oaks. There was a fire pit in the center made of stones, and a weathered wooden picnic table off to one side. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts, making the whole scene look almost magical, almost peaceful. I felt some of my anxiety ease as we climbed out of the car and stretched our cramped legs. Ava was grinning from ear to ear, clearly thrilled that we'd finally made it. We immediately set about unloading the car and setting up camp. The tent proved more difficult than expected. Neither of us had much experience with the collapsible poles and stakes, and we fumbled with them for nearly an hour. By the time we finally had it standing upright and secured, sweat was dripping down my back despite the cooling temperature. Ava had more success with organizing our supplies, arranging everything neatly near the tent entrance. Our sleeping bags, lanterns, cooking equipment, and cooler were all within easy reach. By the time everything was set up to our satisfaction, it was already past 6 in the evening. The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows between the trees were growing longer and darker. The temperature had dropped noticeably, enough that I pulled on a sweatshirt. Ava suggested we get a fire going before it got too dark to see what we were doing. We gathered fallen branches from the edge of the clearing, being careful to take only dead wood. Ava had brought newspaper and kindling, and she proved surprisingly adept at building a proper fire. Within minutes we had flames crackling in the stone pit, sending up thin trails of smoke that disappeared into the darkening sky. We dragged 2 folding chairs close to the fire, and collapsed into them, exhausted but satisfied with our work. The fire was mesmerizing. I found myself staring into the flames, watching them dance and shift, feeling the warmth on my face while the air behind me grew steadily colder. We cooked hot dogs on long sticks, holding them over the fire until the skin split and blackened. They tasted better than any meal I'd had in weeks. Afterward, we roasted marshmallows, laughing when mine caught fire and I had to blow it out quickly, leaving it charred on the outside and molten within. We talked about everything and nothing. Work frustrations, family drama, plans for the future. Ava told me about a guy she'd been seeing, how she wasn't sure if it was going anywhere. I confided that I was thinking about quitting my job, maybe going back to school. The conversation flowed easily in the way it does with old friends, accompanied by the popping of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest grew louder. I became aware of insects chirping all around us, a constant background noise that I hadn't noticed before. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The trees creaked and swayed. Every now and then I'd hear a crack or snap from the darkness beyond our firelight, and I'd tense up, scanning the tree line. But nothing emerged. Just the normal sounds of a forest at night, I told myself. Animals going about their business. Around 10 o'clock we both started yawning. The long drive and physical work of setting up camp had caught up with us. Ava suggested we call it a night, and I readily agreed. We doused the fire carefully, making sure every ember was extinguished. Without the firelight, the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Our lantern provided only a small bubble of illumination as we made our way to the tent. Inside, we arranged our sleeping bags and pillows. The tent felt smaller than it had looked from outside, and I was acutely aware of how thin the nylon walls were, just a single layer of fabric between us and whatever was out there in the dark. I tried to push the thought away. We were fine. People camped out here all the time without incident. We turned off the lantern and settled into our sleeping bags. In the complete darkness, every sound seemed amplified. I could hear Ava's breathing gradually slow and deepen as she drifted off. I tried to relax, but my mind kept racing. I thought about work, about the drive home, about whether I'd remembered to lock my apartment door. Normal anxieties that gradually faded as exhaustion finally began to win. I must have dozed off at some point, though I'm not sure for how long. When I jerked awake, my heart was already pounding. Something had disturbed me, pulled me up from sleep. I lay there in the darkness, disoriented, trying to figure out what had woken me. The tent was pitch black. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I could hear Ava's steady breathing beside me. She was still asleep. Then I heard it again, a metallic clatter from outside, loud enough to make me flinch. It sounded like our cooking pot being knocked over, followed by the rattle of utensils. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into our supplies. A raccoon, maybe, or a possum. We'd been careful to put the food away. But maybe we'd missed something. I waited, listening for any other sounds. The noises continued, scraping, clanging, the unmistakable sound of something rifling through our campsite. I lay there frozen, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to stay in the relative safety of the tent and wait for whatever it was to leave. But another part, the responsible part, knew we should probably scare it off before it made too much of a mess or got into food that might make it sick. I reached over and found the lantern, switching it on to its lowest setting. The dim light didn't penetrate far, but it was enough to see Ava still sleeping soundly beside me. She had always been a deep sleeper. She'd once slept through a car alarm going off directly outside her apartment window. I envied her that ability, especially now. I sat up slowly, listening. The noises outside had stopped for a moment, as if whatever was out there had noticed the light. I crawled toward the tent entrance, moving as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking as I reached for the zipper. The metal teeth made a soft sound as I slowly pulled it down, trying to make as little noise as possible. Through the widening gap, I could see our campsite illuminated by moonlight. The moon had risen while we slept, nearly full, casting everything in shades of silver and black. I had the zipper halfway down when a sound split the night that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A high-pitched screech that started low and rose to an almost unbearable pitch, like metal being scraped across glass, combined with an animal's cry of pain. It lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds felt like an eternity. The sound seemed to come from right outside our tent, maybe only 20 feet away. My hand froze on the zipper. My breath caught in my throat. That was no raccoon. That wasn't any animal I could identify. The sound was so unnatural, so wrong, that every instinct in my body screamed at me to hide, to make myself as small as possible and pray that whatever had made that noise would go away. Behind me, I heard Ava stir and gasp. The sound had finally penetrated her sleep. I don't know what made me continue unzipping the tent. Curiosity? Stupidity? Some primal need to see the source of the threat? My hands moved almost of their own accord, pulling the zipper the rest of the way down. I leaned forward, peering out into the moonlit clearing. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Our campsite looked exactly as we'd left it. The fire pit with its circle of stones, the picnic table, our folding chairs still arranged near where the fire had been. The car was parked at the edge of the clearing, its windows reflecting the moonlight. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. I felt a rush of relief. Maybe whatever had made that noise had already run off. Maybe it was farther away than I'd thought. Then I saw movement by the chairs. My eyes struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. There was something there. Something that shouldn't be. A shape that seemed all wrong. It was standing upright, taller than a person, maybe 7 feet high. At first glance, in the uncertain moonlight, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was too thin, too angular to be a bear. The thing's limbs were impossibly long and spindly, like branches or the legs of a giant spider. They seemed to bend at odd angles as it moved. Its body was covered in what looked like matted dark fur, or maybe mud. I couldn't tell which. But it was the head that truly terrified me. In profile against the moonlight, it looked elongated, almost like a deer's skull, but there was something fundamentally wrong about the proportions. The neck was too long, the shape was too narrow. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the thing tilted its head at an unnatural angle, as if listening. Then it moved, and the way it moved made my stomach lurch. Its limbs didn't move like an animal's should. They seemed to fold and unfold in ways that defied normal anatomy, carrying it across our campsite in a jerky, disjointed gait that looked both random and purposeful. The creature paused near our cooler, that horrible head swiveling as if sniffing the air. I held my breath, not daring to move. Every muscle in my body was rigid with terror. My rational mind tried to find an explanation, a deformed bear, maybe, or a sick elk, or even just a person in some kind of costume pulling a sick prank, but nothing about what I was seeing fit those explanations. This thing was wrong in a way that bypassed logic and spoke directly to some ancient, animal part of my brain that knew predators when it saw them. Then it screamed again. This time I was looking right at it, and I saw its jaw drop open far wider than should have been possible. The sound that emerged was even worse up close. That same metallic screeching combined with something that sounded almost like words, like someone trying to speak through a destroyed throat. The sound physically hurt, and I clapped my hand over one ear while using the other hand to frantically zip the tent closed. I scrambled backward, nearly falling over Ava in my panic. She was sitting up now, her face pale in the lantern light, eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I couldn't answer. I didn't have words for what we'd just heard. We huddled together in the center of the tent, listening. The thing outside continued to move around our campsite. We could hear its footsteps, an irregular pattern that didn't sound like any four-legged animal. It seemed to circle the tent, and at one point I swear I saw the tent wall push inward slightly, as if something was pressing against it from outside. Ava grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt, and I grabbed her back just as hard. Neither of us made a sound. The creature let out several more cries throughout the night, each one sending fresh waves of terror through us. Sometimes they were short, almost like questioning barks. Other times they were long, drawn-out wails that seemed to go on forever. Between the screams we could hear it moving, always moving, sometimes close and sometimes farther away. At one point there was a tremendous crash as if it had knocked over the picnic table. Another time we heard metal scraping, maybe it had found our cooking pot again. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. We didn't dare turn off the lantern, even though its light made us feel exposed. We didn't speak except in the briefest whispers. Ava suggested we try to make a run for the car, but I shook my head. The car keys were in my backpack, and even if we could get to them and unlock the door, the creature was faster than us. I'd seen how it moved. We wouldn't make it. So we waited. We sat there in that tent, hearts pounding, jumping at every sound, praying to God that the thin nylon walls would somehow be enough to protect us. I had never been religious, but that night I prayed more fervently than I ever had in my life. I made bargains with a God I wasn't sure I believed in. Please just let us live through this and I'll be a better person. I'll go to church, I'll do anything. Just please don't let that thing come into this tent. Gradually, imperceptibly, the darkness began to lighten. The sounds outside became less frequent. The last scream we heard was around 4 in the morning, and after that there was only silence. We waited another hour, neither of us willing to trust that it was truly gone. The morning bird song started up. Normal, everyday birds making normal, everyday sounds, and that more than anything convinced us that the nightmare might actually be over. When the sky had lightened enough that we could see properly, we finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent. I went first, emerging slowly into the early morning air. The sun hadn't quite risen yet, but there was enough light to see that our campsite was a disaster. The picnic table was indeed overturned. Our cooler had been opened and its contents scattered. Pots and utensils were strewn across the clearing, but there was no sign of the creature. We didn't speak as we packed. We moved with frantic, desperate speed, throwing everything into the car without bothering to fold or organize anything. The tent came down in record time. We didn't care about leaving the site clean. We didn't care about anything except getting out of there as fast as humanly possible. I kept glancing at the tree line, terrified that I'd see that thing emerge from the shadows. The drive back was silent. Both of us were too shaken to talk about what had happened. We were exhausted but too wired to sleep. Every shadow on the road made my heart race. It wasn't until we were back in civilization, surrounded by buildings and people and traffic, that I finally started to breathe normally again. We never did figure out what we encountered that night. I've spent hours searching online for explanations. Bears with mange, moose with neurological disorders, even elaborate hoaxes. Nothing fits what we saw and heard. Ava and I have talked about it only a few times since then, and never in detail. It's as if speaking about it too much might somehow summon it back. I haven't been camping since that night in June 2017. I haven't even gone for a hike in the woods. The thought of being surrounded by trees, of being that far from safety, makes my hands shake and my breathing quicken. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I can hear that screech, but it's only car horns or sirens or the normal sounds of the city. Whatever was out there in those woods, I know one thing for certain. Some places aren't meant for humans. Some places belong to things we don't understand and shouldn't disturb. I'll never go back to that clearing, and I'll never forget the sight of that thing moving through the moonlight, or the sound of its impossible voice splitting the night air. I pray to God I never encounter anything like it again. This happened 13 years ago, when I was 17 years old. Even now, as I write this, my hands tremble slightly at the keyboard. Some memories fade with time, softening around the edges until they become more like distant dreams than actual events. This is not one of those memories. Every detail remains crystalline, sharp enough to cut. It was late June when my stepfather Glenn suggested we take our annual camping trip. School had just let out for winter break, and I was already restless, counting down the days until I could escape the monotony of our suburban Queensland neighborhood. Glenn had been taking me on these expeditions since he married my mother 4 years earlier, and I'd grown to cherish them, not just for the adventure but for the relationship we'd built in those wilderness hours, away from the complications of blended family dynamics. Glenn worked as a contractor, rough hands and weathered skin testifying to decades of outdoor labor. He'd grown up in the bush, learning to track, hunt, and survive from his own father. When he came into my life, he brought with him a wealth of knowledge that he seemed genuinely eager to share. He never tried to replace my biological father, who'd left when I was 8, but instead carved out his own place in my world, teaching me things I actually wanted to learn. This year we're going deep, Glenn had said over breakfast that morning, spreading a worn topographical map across the kitchen table. His calloused finger traced a route that wound through increasingly remote terrain. Place called Barker's Creek. Been wanting to check it out for years. Supposed to be untouched. Barely anyone goes out that far anymore. I leaned over the map, studying the thin lines and contour markings. The site he'd indicated sat in a region where the map itself seemed to blur, where creeks had no names and roads dissolved into dotted suggestions of tracks that might not exist anymore. How far? 9 hours, maybe 10, depending on the roads. We'll need to stock up proper. No shops once we pass Dalton Ridge. He tapped another spot on the map. This one still firmly in civilization. And no phone reception. Not for the whole week we're out there. The isolation should have excited me. Instead, I felt a peculiar flutter in my stomach. Something that wasn't quite excitement and wasn't quite dread. I shook it off. Probably just nerves about being so far from everything familiar. We left before dawn. Glenn's battered Toyota Land Cruiser loaded with camping gear, food supplies, and 2 rifles secured in the locked box in the truck bed. The rifles were for wild pigs. Queensland's countryside was overrun with the feral beasts, and Glenn had taught me to hunt them responsibly, using every part of what we killed. The drive was long, brutally long. We left behind sealed roads after the first 4 hours, bouncing along dirt tracks that grew progressively rougher. Glenn's old cassette player cycled through his collection of country music, Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, and his favorite Slim Dusty. The music competed with the rattling of our supplies and the grinding of the engine as we crawled across terrain that barely qualified as a road. "Tell me again why we're going so far out," I asked around hour 7, my backside numb from the constant jostling. Glenn glanced at me, a slight smile on his weathered face. "Because that's where nobody else is. The popular spots, everyone in their dog camps there now. Rubbish everywhere. Drunk idiots on trail bikes, no respect for the land. Out at Barker's Creek, it's just us and nature. The way camping's supposed to be." I nodded, though the logic seemed less appealing as we drove deeper into increasingly desolate country. The landscape had changed over the past hours, transforming from the green farmland near home to scrubby bushland, and now to something wilder, more primal. The trees here grew different, gnarled and twisted, their bark darkened to near black. The undergrowth seemed denser, more aggressive in the way it encroached on the barely visible track. "Haven't seen another vehicle in over an hour," I observed. "Won't see one for a week," Glenn replied cheerfully. "That's the point, mate." We arrived at Barker's Creek just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost artificially vibrant. The campsite Glenn had chosen sat in a clearing roughly 30 meters across, bordered on one side by a tree line and creek, and opening onto scrubby grassland on the other sides. It was beautiful in an austere way, the kind of beauty that feels indifferent to human presence. "Right then," Glenn said, killing the engine. The sudden silence felt massive, pressing in from all sides. "Let's get set up before we lose the light." We worked with practiced efficiency, a routine refined over years of these trips. Glenn's tent went up first, a sturdy 3-person canvas affair that had weathered countless expeditions. Mine came next, a smaller dome tent that I could assemble in under 10 minutes. We positioned them roughly 10 meters apart, both facing away from the prevailing wind. The camp kitchen came last, a fold-out table, our cooking supplies, the ice-filled coolers containing our food, and Glenn's precious camp stove. He refused to rely solely on campfire cooking, insisting a good stove was the difference between a successful trip and a miserable one. "Still got a couple hours of light," Glenn noted, checking his watch. "Want to take a quick walk, see if we can spot any pig sign?" I grabbed my rifle, a .243 Winchester that Glenn had helped me purchase with money I'd saved from working at the local grocery store. We loaded up and headed into the bush, Glenn reading the landscape with practiced ease. He pointed out tracks, disturbed earth where pigs had been rooting, and fresh droppings that indicated we'd have good hunting prospects during our stay. But as we walked, that earlier flutter in my stomach returned, stronger now. The bush felt wrong somehow, though I couldn't articulate how or why. The sounds seemed muted, not the vibrant chorus of birds and insects I'd come to expect in these environments. Instead, an oppressive quiet hung over everything, broken only by our footsteps and breathing. "You feel that?" Glenn asked suddenly, his voice low. "Feel what?" He paused, scanning the tree line. "Like we're being watched." The words sent a genuine shiver through me, validating my own unease. Glenn wasn't prone to flights of fancy. If he felt something off, there was probably a reason. We stood there for a long moment, rifles held loosely but ready, searching the shadows beneath the trees for any sign of movement. "Probably just a big boar," Glenn finally said, though he didn't sound convinced. "They're smart bastards. Could be one keeping tabs on us, trying to work out if we're a threat." We returned to camp as dusk settled in properly. That brief window where the world transforms from day to night. Glenn got a fire going while I sorted through our food supplies, planning dinner. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across our campsite. Normally, I found these sounds comforting. Tonight they seemed to emphasize the vast darkness pressing in around us. We ate beef stew heated over the fire, washed down with Billy tea so strong it could strip paint. Glenn was quieter than usual, I noticed. He sat in his camp chair, staring into the flames with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concerned? Thoughtful? Uneasy? "Everything all right?" He looked up, seeming to shake off whatever thoughts had captured him. "Yeah, mate. Just tired from the drive. Thinking I might turn in early. Get a good night's rest. Big plans for tomorrow. Want to hike up to the ridge. See what's beyond." "Sounds good. I might stay up a bit. Listen to some music." Glenn nodded, standing and stretching. "Don't stay up too late. And keep the fire going. Gets cold out here at night." He disappeared into his tent, and within minutes I could hear his familiar snoring. A deep, rhythmic rumble that had become a comforting soundtrack to our camping trips. I settled into my camp chair, pulling it closer to the fire, and pressed play on my portable CD player. Music filled my ears through cheap headphones, providing a buffer against the oppressive silence of the bush. An hour passed, maybe more. I'd gone through most of my favorite album, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. I should have been tired. We'd been on the road for nearly 11 hours, but I felt wired, my nerves singing with an alertness that didn't match the peaceful scene. I got up to add more wood to the fire, keeping it bright. As I arranged the logs, I noticed something that made me freeze. Our campsite looked disturbed. Not dramatically so, but in small ways that seemed wrong. Glenn's camp chair had been moved. I was certain he'd left it on the other side of the fire. The cooler lid sat slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered Glenn closing it firmly after dinner, and there were marks in the dirt near my tent, scuff marks that looked almost like someone had been walking around the perimeter. I grabbed my torch, a heavy maglite that could double as a weapon, and swept the beam across the campsite. Everything looked normal in the harsh white light, but that only made the small inconsistencies more unsettling. Things had been moved, someone or something had been in our camp. My first thought was another camper, maybe someone we hadn't noticed during our arrival, but that didn't make sense. We hadn't seen any other vehicles, and Glenn had specifically chosen this location for its isolation. A local? Someone who used this area regularly and didn't appreciate intruders. That seemed more plausible, but also more concerning. If someone was out here, why not just approach us directly? I considered waking Glenn, but decided against it. What would I tell him? That a camp chair had moved and a cooler was open. He'd probably laugh, tell me I was being paranoid. Maybe I was. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on my memory. But then I heard it. A sound that definitely wasn't my imagination. It came from the direction of the creek, a splashing noise like something large moving through water. My first thought was a pig coming down to drink. We'd hoped to find game around the water source, but the splashing continued, not the brief sound of an animal drinking, but sustained movement, as if something was wading through the creek. I killed my headphones, needing to hear clearly. The splashing stopped. The silence that followed felt expectant, heavy with tension. I found myself holding my breath, straining to catch any sound. Then I heard footsteps, not the four-legged gait of an animal, but the deliberate two-legged rhythm of a person walking. They were moving through the bush parallel to our campsite, maintaining a distance of maybe 40 or 50 meters. The steps were careful, measured, as if whoever was out there was trying to move quietly but not quite managing it. My heart rate kicked up several notches. I grabbed my rifle, checking that it was loaded, thumb resting on the safety. The footsteps continued their circuit, moving in an arc that kept whoever was out there hidden in the darkness beyond our firelight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt worse than the sounds had. I stood there, rifle held across my chest, every sense screaming that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds that felt like minutes. I couldn't tell. Then, from a completely different direction, I heard my name. "Chris," a voice called, distant and muffled. "Chris, come here." The voice sounded like Glenn. Same rough timbre, same Queensland accent. But Glenn was in his tent, not 10 meters away, snoring loud enough that I could hear him even over my racing heartbeat. I spun toward the tent, seeing the familiar shape of canvas undisturbed, the sound of his snoring unchanged. "Chris," the voice called again, still coming from the tree line. "Need you to come here, mate." Terror washed over me, cold and absolute. Someone out there was mimicking Glenn's voice. Not perfectly, there was something off about it. Something hollow, but close enough that in confusion or darkness I might have responded, might have walked into those trees toward whoever was out there. I stood frozen, my rifle gripped so tightly my knuckles ached. The voice didn't call again, but I could sense presence in the darkness, something watching, waiting to see what I would do. My mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. A person with mental illness, wandering the bush, possible, but unlikely this far from anywhere. Someone deliberately trying to scare us off? But why go to such elaborate lengths? And how had they known my name? Glenn had used it around camp, but you'd have to be quite close to hear normal conversation, and we'd definitely have noticed someone that near. The third possibility, the one I didn't want to consider but couldn't ignore. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place. Maybe Glenn had been right to feel uneasy earlier. Maybe we'd stumbled into someone's territory, someone who didn't want visitors and was willing to use psychological tactics to drive us away. I needed to wake Glenn. Whatever was happening, I couldn't face it alone. But the 10 meters between my position and his tent suddenly seemed vast, exposed. To reach him, I'd have to turn my back on the tree line, on whatever was out there watching. I compromised, backing slowly toward his tent while keeping my eyes and rifle trained on the darkness. Each step felt like an eternity. The fire crackled, sending up sparks, and in the brief flare of light, I thought I saw movement near the trees, just a suggestion of a shape, there and gone. So quickly I couldn't be sure I'd seen anything at all. "Glenn," I hissed, reaching his tent. "Glenn, wake up." His snoring continued, uninterrupted. I risked a glance away from the tree line to unzip his tent, reaching in to shake his shoulder roughly. "Glenn, wake up." He jolted awake with a snort, immediately alert in the way people who've spent a lifetime in the bush learn to be. "What?" "Something's out there, in the trees. It was calling my name in your voice." Even in the dim light from the fire, I saw his expression shift from confusion to sharp concern. He grabbed his rifle, checking it by touch, and emerged from the tent in his thermal underwear and boots. "Where?" I pointed toward the tree line. "Over there." But it was moving around, like it was circling the camp. And earlier, I heard footsteps. Glenn stood beside me, his rifle up, scanning the darkness. Human footsteps. I think so. Not four-legged anyway. We stood there together, two humans alone in the wilderness, staring into darkness that suddenly felt malevolent. Glenn reached for his torch, a powerful spotlight he used for night hunting, and began sweeping the beam across the tree line. The light revealed bark and leaves, the twisted shapes of eucalyptus trees, the dense undergrowth typical of this region. Nothing moved, nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched intensified under the harsh illumination, as if whatever was out there resented the light, resented being searched for. "There," I said suddenly, pointing to a section of trees on the far side of the clearing. I saw something move. Glenn swung the spotlight in that direction, catching the beam on a large tree with pale peeling bark. For just a moment, I thought I saw a shape behind the trunk, tall, impossibly thin, moving with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for a human. But when Glenn held the light steady, there was nothing there. "Probably just shadows," Glenn said, but his voice carried an uncertainty I'd never heard before. "Trees playing tricks in the light." "It called my name," I insisted, "in your voice, while you were sleeping." He looked at me then, really looked, and whatever he saw in my face convinced him I wasn't making this up or imagining things. "Right, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk out there, have a proper look around. You stay here, keep the fire bright, and keep your rifle ready. If you see anything, and I mean anything, you yell for me and fire a warning shot into the air. Understand?" "Glenn, I don't think you should." "I'm not spending the night wondering what's out there." He cut me off, his voice firm. "Could be someone who needs help. Could be a dingo that's gotten too bold. Could be nothing at all. But I'm going to check. Stay alert." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him this was a terrible idea, that every instinct I had was screaming at us to pack up and leave immediately. But Glenn was already moving, his spotlight cutting a path through the darkness as he walked toward the tree line. I watched him go, my own rifle raised, sweeping the visible area around him for any sign of threat. He reached the trees and paused, listening. I could see him in profile, illuminated by his own light, every sense focused on the bush around him. He took a step into the trees, then another, until the foliage began to swallow him. His light became a diffuse glow, filtering through leaves and branches. Then it went out. "Glenn," I shouted, my voice cracking with sudden terror. "Glenn, your light!" For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, there was only darkness and silence. Then the light flickered back on, and I heard Glenn curse loudly. "Battery terminal came loose," he called back. "I'm all right." But he didn't sound all right. His voice carried an edge I couldn't identify. Shock, maybe, or fear. He emerged from the tree line walking quickly, his movements stiff and purposeful. As he got closer to the fire, I could see his face clearly, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Glenn's face was pale, drained of color in a way that looked almost unnatural in the firelight. His eyes were wide, the whites showing all around the irises, and his jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. "Pack everything," he said flatly. "We're leaving, now." "What did you see?" "Pack everything. We're leaving." "Glenn, tell me what." "Now," he barked, and I'd never heard that tone from him before. Sharp, commanding, with an underlying current of barely controlled panic. We moved into action, throwing our careful camp setup into chaos. Tents came down in minutes rather than the usual careful dismantling. We stuffed sleeping bags into their sacks without rolling them properly, tossed cooking supplies into boxes without organizing them, loaded everything into the truck bed with none of our usual methodical arrangement. Glenn kept the spotlight on while we worked, constantly sweeping it across the surrounding bush. I followed his lead with my torch, creating a perimeter of light around us as we frantically packed. My hands were shaking so badly I kept dropping things: tent poles, torch batteries, the cap to our water container. "Is it still out there?" I asked. "Don't know. Don't care. We're not staying to find out." As we loaded the last of our gear, I caught sight of something that made me stop. Near the tree line, just at the edge of where our light reached, there were marks in the dirt. They looked like footprints, but wrong, too narrow, too long, with a strange splayed shape that didn't match any human footprint I'd ever seen. And there were dozens of them, circling our campsite in a path that came within meters of where we'd been sleeping. "Glenn," I said, pointing. He followed my gaze and his face somehow went even paler. "In the truck, now." I climbed into the passenger seat, my rifle clutched across my lap, while Glenn threw himself behind the wheel. He turned the key. The starter motor turned over once, twice. The engine didn't catch. "Come on," Glenn muttered, turning the key again. "Come on, you bastard." The engine turned over but refused to fire. Glenn pumped the accelerator. Tried again. Nothing. The truck that had never failed us, that Glenn maintained meticulously, chose this moment to be temperamental. "It's flooded," Glenn said, his voice tight. "Just needs a minute." But we didn't have a minute, because as we sat there in the cab, the lights from our torches still burning in the truck bed, illuminating the campsite we were desperately trying to leave, I saw movement at the tree line. At first it was just a sense of something shifting in the shadows, a disturbance in the pattern of light and dark that my brain struggled to process. Then it stepped forward, and I got my first clear look at what had been stalking us. The figure that emerged from the trees defied easy description. It was humanoid in the broadest sense. 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture, but wrong in every detail. The proportions were all off. Limbs too long and joints that seemed to bend at strange angles. The body appeared emaciated, bones visible through skin that looked waxy and pale in our lights. But it was the face that stopped my breath. Even from 30 meters away, even in the uncertain light, I could see enough to know I'd never forget it. The skull structure seemed elongated, the jaw too wide, and the mouth hung open in what might have been a grin, or might have been something else entirely. The eyes reflected our light with an animal's eyeshine, but the color was wrong, too pale, too vacant. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. The figure cocked its head, that too wide mouth opening wider, and I realized with horror that it was mimicking human posture, human curiosity. It took a step toward us, movement flowing with an unnatural grace. "Glenn," I said, my voice barely audible. "Glenn, start the truck." He turned the key again. The engine turned over sluggishly but still wouldn't catch. The figure took another step, now close enough that I could see details I wished I couldn't: the unnatural length of the fingers, the way the skin seemed to hang loose in places, the strange texture of what might have been clothing, or might have been something else entirely. "Please," I heard myself saying. "Please, God, please start the truck." Glenn tried again, and again. The figure kept coming, each step deliberate, purposeful. It was 20 meters away now, then 15. I could hear sounds. Wet, clicking noises that might have been breathing, or might have been something trying to form words. Then, with a roar that sounded like salvation, the engine caught and fired. Glenn slammed it into gear without waiting for it to warm up, and we lurched forward, our camp supplies sliding and crashing in the truck bed. The headlights swept across the clearing as Glenn cranked the wheel, bringing us around to face the rough track that led back toward civilization. In that brief moment when the headlights passed across where the figure had been, I saw it clearly. It was less than 10 meters away, close enough that I could see its face in full detail. The stretched skin, the too many teeth in that gaping mouth, eyes that reflected our light with an intelligence that was worse than any mindless monster could have been. And it was smiling. Not the automatic stretching of facial muscles, but a deliberate expression that conveyed recognition, amusement, and something that might have been anticipation, as if this was all a game, and it was enjoying watching us scramble to escape. Then we were moving, bouncing over the rough ground, leaving the clearing and that thing behind. I twisted in my seat, looking back through the rear window, and saw it standing exactly where we'd left it, perfectly still now, watching us retreat. The light from our torches in the truck bed illuminated it for several long seconds as we drove away, and I watched it the entire time, unable to look away despite every instinct telling me to turn around, to pretend I hadn't seen it clearly. Just before we lost sight of the clearing, the figure raised one impossibly long arm and waved a slow, deliberate gesture that was somehow more terrifying than any aggressive action could have been. Neither of us spoke for the first hour. Glenn drove with intense focus, navigating the rough track in darkness with only our headlights to guide us. I sat rigid in the passenger seat, rifle still across my lap, checking the mirrors obsessively for any sign of pursuit. The track was even worse at night, every bump and hole magnified by the darkness. Several times the truck's undercarriage scraped against high spots, the sound of metal on rock making us both flinch. Glenn didn't slow down. If anything, he pushed harder, taking corners faster than was safe, gunning the engine over rough sections that should have been crawled across carefully. My mind kept returning to those last moments in the clearing. The figure's face, that unnatural smile, the wave. What had we seen? My rational mind tried to find explanations. Someone with a severe medical condition, maybe. Something that caused unusual bone growth and emaciation. But that didn't explain the movement, the grace, the intelligent gleam in those pale eyes. And it definitely didn't explain how it had mimicked Glenn's voice or why it had been circling our camp for hours. "What did you see?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. "When you went into the trees, what did you see that made you want to leave?" Glenn's hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles going white. For a long moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Bones," he said quietly. "A pile of them, just inside the tree line. Animal mostly. Kangaroo, pig, maybe wallobo. But," he paused, swallowing hard. "But there were others too. A boot, with the foot still in it. Shreds of clothing. Evidence of a campfire. Supplies scattered around. Someone had been there, maybe weeks ago, maybe months, and they didn't leave." The implications of that statement washed over me like cold water. Someone else had camped at Barker's Creek. Someone who hadn't made it out. "We need to tell the police," I said. "We will, soon as we get somewhere with reception. But first we need to get the hell out of this area." We drove through the night, neither of us willing to stop even for a moment. Glenn kept the truck moving, even when the track became barely navigable. Even when we scraped the undercarriage so hard I was certain we'd torn something important loose. The normal 9-hour drive back to civilization took us nearly 6, Glenn pushing the truck to its limits and beyond. Dawn was breaking when we finally reached sealed road, and with it the first signs of the modern world. Road signs, fence lines, power poles stringing along the highway. The sight of these ordinary things brought a rush of relief so intense I felt lightheaded. "We made it," I said, though the words felt insufficient for what we'd survived. Glenn nodded, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders.
"We did, but, Chris..."
He glanced at me, his expression serious. "What we saw back there, we need to decide what we're going to tell people. The police, your mum, anyone who asks why we came back early. What do you mean?" "We tell them the truth." "The truth," Glenn said slowly, "is going to sound insane. We'll say we saw someone stalking our camp, found evidence of another camper who might have come to harm, and decided to leave for safety reasons. That's all true, but the rest of it, the thing we saw, the voice calling your name, if we start talking about that, people are going to think we had some kind of shared hysteria or that we're making it up for attention. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that we tell everything exactly as it happened, but I could already imagine the skeptical looks, the gentle suggestions that exhaustion and fear had played tricks on us, the unspoken questions about our mental state. So we just keep it to ourselves? We know what happened, Glenn said. That's what matters. We survived. We're here. We're safe. Some things don't need to be shared with people who weren't there. We stopped at the first town large enough to have a police station, a dusty outback settlement with a population that probably didn't crack 300. The local sergeant listened to our story with the kind of professional attention that suggested he'd heard plenty of strange tales from the bush. When Glenn described finding the remains, the sergeant's expression shifted to genuine concern. "You're sure about the location?" he asked, making notes on a pad that looked like it had been used for grocery lists and duty rosters alike. Glenn provided coordinates from his GPS unit.
Should be able to find it easy enough.
The camp's still set up, mostly. We left in a hurry. And you didn't see anyone else in the area. No other vehicles. Nothing, Glenn confirmed. We were alone out there, or thought we were. The sergeant made more notes, asked a few more questions about timing and details, then assured us someone would check it out. Probably find it was just a campsite from years ago. People abandon gear all the time, especially if they're walking in. Doesn't necessarily mean something bad happened. But his tone suggested he didn't quite believe his own words. The bush had a way of keeping its secrets, and we all knew it. We called my mother from the station, explaining that we'd cut the trip short due to safety concerns. She was confused but relieved to hear from us, and Glenn promised we'd be home by dinner. The long drive back to Brisbane passed in a blur of exhaustion and residual adrenaline. In the weeks that followed, I learned that a police team had visited Barker's Creek. They confirmed finding what Glenn had described, evidence of an old campsite, scattered remains that were sent for analysis. The official report concluded they were animal bones, the boot and clothing abandoned gear, nothing to suggest foul play. The case was noted and filed away. Glenn and I never talked about it again, not in any detailed way. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with an expression that suggested he was remembering that night, thinking about what we'd seen. Once, when I was loading gear for a weekend camping trip with school friends, he pulled me aside. "Stick to the popular campgrounds," he said quietly. "Places with other people around. The deep bush, it's not always safe, not in the way you'd think." I nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying.
We'd stumbled onto something at Barker's Creek, something that had been there long before us and would probably be there long after. Something that had learned to mimic human voices, to stalk and watch, to wait in the darkness for the unwary.
Glenn passed away 3 years later, a heart attack at a job site. He went quick, they said. Probably didn't even know it was happening. At his funeral, I thought about that night, about how he'd charged into the darkness to check on strange sounds, how he'd found the evidence that suggested we weren't the first to camp at that cursed clearing, how he'd gotten us out safely despite his own terror. I'm older now, married with 2 kids of my own. They sometimes ask about going camping, and I struggle with how to answer. Part of me wants to share Glenn's love of the wilderness with them, to teach them the skills he taught me. But another part, the part that still sees that pale face in my nightmares, the part that still hears my name called in a voice that wasn't Glenn's, wants to keep them far from the deep bush and whatever lurks there. I compromise. We camp at established sites, places with other families around, with rangers nearby, with cell phone reception. My children think I'm overprotective. My wife thinks I'm just being sensible. Neither knows the full story of what happened at Barker's Creek 13 years ago. But sometimes, on clear nights when we're sitting around our carefully managed campfire at some well-populated holiday park, I'll hear something in the distance, a sound that's almost but not quite human, a voice calling from the darkness, and I'll remember that thing standing in our headlights, watching us flee with what I can only describe as patient amusement. I'll remember the pile of bones Glenn found, evidence of someone who camped where they shouldn't have. I'll remember the footprints circling our tents, the hours of stalking before it revealed itself. And I'll remember Glenn's final words to me about the bush. It's not always safe, not in the way you'd think. The wilderness is beautiful, mysterious, and ancient, but it doesn't belong to us. Not really. We're visitors in a world that existed long before human civilization and will continue long after we're gone. Most of the time, that's fine. We camp and hike and explore, and nothing happens except memories of good times in nature. But sometimes, rarely, thankfully, we stumble onto something that reminds us we're not at the top of the food chain everywhere. We're not the only intelligent things that call the wild places home, and some of those other things have learned about us, studied us, maybe even developed their own methods of dealing with human intrusion into their territory. I don't know what we saw at Barker's Creek. I've researched, read accounts of strange sightings, tried to find reports of similar encounters. I found a few stories that sound familiar. Campers fleeing remote sites in terror, hikers reporting being stalked through the bush, voices calling from the darkness, but nothing concrete, nothing that gives me answers. Maybe it was a person with severe mental and physical illness living wild in the bush. Maybe it was some animal I don't have a name for, something that's learned to stand upright and mimic sounds. Maybe it was something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into the neat categories our civilization has created for sorting the world. Whatever it was, it's still out there. The bush is vast, unexplored in many places, and Queensland's wilderness holds more secrets than any of us realize. Most people will never encounter anything more dangerous than a snake or a cranky cassowary. Their camping trips will be exactly what they expect, a chance to disconnect and enjoy nature's beauty. But a very small number, the unlucky ones, will stumble into the wrong place at the wrong time. They'll feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the darkness. They'll hear their names called in familiar voices from impossible directions. They'll see something that doesn't quite fit, something that their rational minds will struggle to process. If you're one of those unlucky ones, my advice is simple: leave immediately. Don't try to investigate. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't convince yourself you're being paranoid. Pack up as quickly as you can and get back to civilization. The wilderness will always be there for another trip, another time, another place. But if you ignore the warning signs, if you stay when every instinct is screaming at you to flee, you might end up like that person whose boot Glenn found. Another scattered collection of remains in a remote clearing. Evidence of someone who camped where they shouldn't have, who stayed when they should have run. I carry a reminder of that night everywhere I go. Not a physical object, but something just as permanent. It's the knowledge that the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. It's the memory of a face that wasn't quite human, of intelligence behind pale eyes, of something that had learned to hunt humans the way we hunt animals. And it's the absolute certainty that if I ever, by accident or misfortune, find myself at a place like Barker's Creek again, I'll recognize it immediately. I'll feel that same oppressive weight of being watched, that same wrongness in the air, and I'll leave without hesitation, without second guessing, without waiting to see what emerges from the trees. Glenn understood that in a way I didn't, not at first. He'd spent his whole life in the bush, had probably encountered strange things before that night, had learned which boundaries shouldn't be crossed. He tried to teach me not just survival skills, but respect for the wilderness and awareness of its dangers, both the ones you can see and the ones you can't. I wish I could thank him for that. I wish I could tell him that his lessons probably saved both our lives that night, that his quick thinking and willingness to flee rather than fight got us home safely. I wish I could ask him if he'd encountered something similar before, if he'd known what we were dealing with even before he found those bones. But he's gone now, and I'm left with memories, questions, and a story that sounds too unbelievable to share with anyone who wasn't there. Most days that's fine. I go about my normal life, work my job, raise my kids, and that night at Barker's Creek feels like a distant nightmare. But sometimes when I'm alone, when it's dark, when the wind is blowing just right, I'll hear something that sounds almost like my name being called. And for just a moment, I'm 17 again, standing in a remote clearing, watching something that shouldn't exist smile at me with too many teeth. Those are the nights I don't get much rest. Those are the nights I remember that the world is bigger and stranger than we admit, that there are places humans probably shouldn't go, and things we're better off never meeting. This is my story. This is what happened at Barker's Creek 13 years ago. I've never told it in full before, but writing it down feels important somehow. Maybe as a warning to others who might stumble into similar situations. Maybe as a way to honor Glenn's memory and the lessons he taught me. Maybe just to prove to myself that it really happened, that I didn't imagine the whole thing. Whatever you choose to believe, whatever explanations you prefer, I can only tell you what I know. There are things in the Australian wilderness that defy easy explanation, places where the rules work differently, where human presence is tolerated but not welcome. And if you're unlucky enough to find yourself in one of those places, your only rational choice is to leave immediately. The bush is beautiful. The bush is ancient. The bush is unforgiving. And sometimes the bush watches back. The Kansas River moved like black oil through the darkness, its surface barely disturbed by the humid August breeze that carried the scent of dying fish and wet earth. My friends and I had been coming to this park in Shawnee for years, drawn by its isolation and the way the ancient cottonwoods created a natural cathedral along the water's edge. But tonight felt different. The fog rolled in thick and suffocating, transforming familiar landmarks into grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse in the dim moonlight. We had parked near the boat ramp as usual, our footsteps muffled by the damp grass as we made our way toward our favorite spot, a clearing where the trees formed a natural amphitheater. The fog clung to everything, reducing visibility to mere feet in any direction. Every breath felt heavy, laden with moisture that seemed to coat the inside of our lungs with each inhalation. "This is some horror movie shit," one of my friends muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The fog seemed to swallow sound, making even our quiet conversation feel intrusive in the oppressive silence. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another tree trunk, pale and slender against the darker bark of the cottonwoods. But then it moved, a subtle rhythmic swaying that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. The movement was hypnotic, pendulum-like, as if the thing was hanging upside down and letting gravity pull it back and forth. But it wasn't hanging, it was standing, perfectly balanced on legs that seemed too thin to support even its slight frame. The creature stood about 5 feet tall, its skin so pale it seemed to glow with its own sickly luminescence. In the dense fog it appeared translucent, almost spectral, as if it existed only partially in our world. Its limbs were elongated and unnaturally thin, giving it the appearance of something that had been stretched on a medieval rack. The torso was narrow, almost concave, with ribs that showed through the alabaster skin like the bars of a cage. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in my veins. 2 brilliant yellow orbs stared at us from a face that was almost human but wrong in every conceivable way. The eyes were too large, too bright, and they seemed to pulse with their own internal light. They reminded me of the eyes of deep-sea creatures, adapted for perpetual darkness, glowing with bioluminescent fury. The yellow was not the warm amber of autumn leaves, but the sick, jaundiced color of infection and decay. The face itself was a nightmare of sharp angles and hollow planes. The cheekbones jutted out like knife blades, casting deep shadows that made it impossible to determine if the creature had a nose or just 2 black holes where one should be. The mouth, if it could be called that, was a thin, lipless slash that seemed to extend too far toward the ears, giving the impression of a permanent sardonic grin. My friends stood frozen beside me, their breathing shallow and rapid. The creature didn't seem to notice us at first. Or if it did, it showed no sign of concern. It simply continued its rhythmic swaying, back and forth, like a metronome keeping time to some unholy symphony only it could hear. The fog swirled around it, and for a moment I lost sight of the thing entirely. When it cleared, the creature was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. My friends nodded, their faces pale and drawn. We stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, staring at the empty space where the creature had been. The fog continued to roll across the park, and every shift in the mist made us jump, expecting to see those terrible yellow eyes materializing from the gloom. Park around us felt different now, charged with a malevolent energy that made the hair on our arms stand on end. The familiar sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of night birds, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, all seemed muted and distorted. It was as if the very air had become thick and viscous, pressing against us from all sides. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the car. Each step felt deliberate and careful, as if the ground itself might give way beneath us. The fog seemed to follow us, tendrils of mist reaching out like grasping fingers. I could feel eyes on us. Not just the yellow orbs we had seen, but others, hidden in the darkness, watching our every move. As we reached the parking area, I turned back one last time. The fog had grown thicker, if that was possible, and the park had disappeared entirely into the white void. But just for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the mist. Multiple shapes, pale and swaying, keeping time to that same unholy rhythm. The drive home was conducted in complete silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had witnessed. The warm interior of the car felt like a sanctuary, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. The familiar streets of Shawnee looked different somehow, as if we were seeing them through a lens that had been slightly distorted. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow orbs staring back at me, pulsing with their sickly light. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on my windows and doors, though I couldn't say exactly what I was trying to keep out. The darkness outside seemed deeper than usual, filled with shapes that moved just beyond the edge of perception. When dawn finally broke, I felt no relief. The sunlight seemed wan and inadequate, unable to fully banish the shadows that had taken root in my mind. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that what we had seen in the park was not a one-time occurrence. The creatures were there, in the fog, in the darkness, waiting and watching. And somehow I knew we would see them again. 3 weeks passed before we returned to the park. 3 weeks of restless nights and lingering unease, of conversations that died abruptly when one of us mentioned what we had seen. We tried to rationalize it, to explain away the impossible sight that had seared itself into our memories. Maybe it was just a trick of the fog, a play of light and shadow that our frightened minds had transformed into something sinister. Maybe we had all succumbed to some form of group hysteria, feeding off each other's fear until we had conjured a monster from nothing. But deep down, we all knew better. The creature had been real. The memory of those yellow eyes remained as vivid and terrifying as the moment we had first seen them. And despite our fear, or perhaps because of it, we found ourselves drawn back to the park like moths to a flame. This time, we came prepared. Flashlights, cameras, even a digital recorder to capture any sounds the creatures might make. We told ourselves we were being scientific, methodical. We were going to document whatever we found and prove to ourselves and others that these things existed. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. We were addicted to the fear, to the terrible thrill of standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. The fog was thicker tonight, if that was possible. It rolled off the Kansas River in dense, suffocating waves, transforming the park into an alien landscape where familiar landmarks became grotesque and threatening. Our flashlights seemed pathetically inadequate against the oppressive darkness, their beams absorbed by the mist after only a few feet. We made our way to the same clearing where we had seen the creature before, moving slowly and quietly, though the fog muffled our footsteps to the point where we could barely hear ourselves walking. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the distant murmur of the river. That's when we heard it. A soft rustling in the trees above us, like the sound of leaves stirring in a non-existent breeze. But there was no wind tonight. The air was still and heavy, pregnant with moisture and something else. Something that made our skin crawl with primal dread. The rustling grew louder, more pronounced, and we realized it wasn't the sound of leaves at all. It was the sound of movement, of multiple forms shifting and swaying in the branches above our heads. The fog made it impossible to see clearly, but we could make out vague shapes among the cottonwoods, pale forms that seemed to blend with the mist itself. "There," one of my friends whispered, pointing up into the canopy. "Do you see them?" I followed his gaze and felt my heart stop. They were everywhere, dozens of them, maybe more, perched on branches like some unholy congregation. The pale, elongated forms swayed in unison, their movements creating a symphony of whispers and creaks that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Their eyes blazed like stars in the darkness, yellow and unblinking, focused on us with an intensity that made my skin feel like it was crawling with insects. They didn't move toward us, didn't make any aggressive gestures, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The air itself seemed to thicken with their attention, pressing against us like a physical weight. One of them was closer than the others, perched on a low branch not 20 feet away. In the pale glow of our flashlights, I could see it more clearly than I had that first night, and the details made my stomach turn. Its skin was not merely pale, it was translucent, revealing the dark network of veins beneath like a roadmap of corruption. The limbs were jointed in ways that defied human anatomy, bending and flexing at angles that should have been impossible. The face was even more disturbing in the direct light. The yellow eyes were set deep in sockets that seemed too large for the skull, giving the impression of a creature that was all eyes and hunger. The nose was barely a suggestion, just two slits that flared and contracted with each breath. The mouth was a wound in the pale flesh, lipless and black, occasionally revealing what might have been teeth or might have been something far worse. But it was their behavior that truly terrified me. They moved with a fluid grace that was utterly alien, their bodies flowing like liquid from one position to another. The swaying motion we had first observed was constant, hypnotic, as if they were all connected to some invisible conductor orchestrating their movements, and they were completely silent. No breathing, no sounds of movement, just the soft whisper of air displaced by their presence. We stood transfixed, unable to move or speak, as the creatures continued their vigil. They seemed to be studying us, cataloging our every movement and expression with those terrible yellow eyes. I had the disturbing sensation that they were not just looking at us but through us, seeing something in our souls that we ourselves were unaware of. The fog began to shift and swirl, and suddenly the creatures were in motion. They moved with impossible speed, flowing from branch to branch like liquid shadows. One moment they were there, the next they had vanished into the mist, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. The movement was so fast it seemed to defy physics, creating afterimages that lingered in our vision like burned retinas. One of them, the closest one, suddenly dropped from its perch, landing silently on the ground just outside our circle of flashlight beams. It stood there for a moment, perfectly still, its yellow eyes fixed on mine. Then it began to move toward us, not walking but gliding, its feet barely touching the ground. We broke and ran. The fog seemed to come alive as we fled, reaching out with tendrils of mist that grasped at our clothes and faces. Behind us I could hear the soft whisper of movement, the creatures following us through the darkness with their inhuman grace. They moved through the fog like ghosts, their forms appearing and disappearing in the mist, always just at the edge of vision. We reached the car and dove inside, slamming the doors and locking them with trembling hands. The engine turned over on the third try, and we sped away from the park as if the hounds of hell were at our heels. In the rearview mirror I caught a glimpse of pale forms standing at the edge of the parking area, watching us disappear into the night. The drive home was a nightmare of paranoia and terror. Every shadow seemed to harbor those yellow eyes. Every movement in the fog might be one of the creatures keeping pace with our car. We drove in silence, but the fear was palpable, filling the vehicle like a toxic gas. When we finally reached safety, we sat in the car for a long time, unwilling to venture out into the darkness. The familiar streets of our neighborhood seemed like foreign territory now, potentially hostile ground where anything might be lurking in the shadows. That night I dreamed of yellow eyes and pale forms moving through endless fog. I woke several times, convinced I could see shapes outside my window swaying in the darkness like living pendulums. The rational part of my mind tried to dismiss it as imagination, but the primal fear that had taken root in my soul knew better. The creatures were real, and they were watching us. Even now, even here, in the supposed safety of our homes, I could feel their presence pressing against the boundaries of our world, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves again. And deep down, I knew that moment was coming soon. The phone call came 3 days later, just as the sun was setting and the shadows began to grow long across my backyard. It was my friend's voice, tight with excitement and fear. "You need to come down to the farm off Highway 7, he said without preamble. "There's a farmer here who's been seeing them too. He wants to talk to us." The farm was a ramshackle affair, the kind of place that had been slowly dying for decades. The barn leaned at a precarious angle, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The farmhouse itself was little better, with warped siding and windows that caught the dying light like dead eyes. But it was the farmer himself who truly disturbed me. He was ancient, his skin weathered and cracked like old leather, his eyes the pale blue of winter sky. When he spoke, his voice was a rasp that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, as if the words had to fight their way past years of accumulated dust and sorrow. "I've been seeing them for near on 30 years, he said, gesturing toward the tree line that bordered his property. "Started just after I bought this place. Thought I was going crazy at first, seeing things in the fog that couldn't be there." We sat on his porch as darkness fell, the old boards creaking under our weight. The fog was beginning to rise from the low places in his fields, and I could already feel that familiar prickle of dread along my spine. "What do they do?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The farmer's eyes took on a distant look as if he was seeing something far beyond the present moment. "They watch," he said simply. "Always watching. But it's gotten worse over the years. They're getting bolder, coming closer to the house." He pointed toward a copse of trees about 100 yards away. "See that stand of oaks? That's where they like to gather. Sometimes there's just one or two, but on nights like this when the fog's thick there can be dozens of them. They stand among the trees, swaying back and forth, and those yellow eyes, God, those eyes." As if summoned by his words, the fog began to thicken around the oak trees. And there, barely visible in the growing darkness, I could see them, pale forms moving among the shadows, their eyes gleaming like malevolent stars. Even at this distance, the sight of them made my blood run cold. "They move so fast," the farmer continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Faster than anything has a right to move. I've seen one of them cross half a mile in what seemed like the blink of an eye. One second it was at the far end of the field, the next it was standing right at the edge of my porch." He paused, his ancient hands trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of water. "That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't slept right since. Keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find one of them standing beside my bed, just watching." The creatures in the oak grove had multiplied as the fog thickened. There were at least a dozen of them now, their forms barely distinguishable from the mist itself. They moved with that same hypnotic swaying motion we had observed in the park. But there was something different about them here. They seemed more agitated, more purposeful. "Have you ever tried to approach them?" my friend asked. The farmer let out a bitter laugh.
Once, about 10 years ago, I was younger then, still had some fight left in me. Took my shotgun and marched right out to those trees, determined to find out what they were.
He fell silent for a long moment, staring at the gathering creatures with an expression of profound unease. They didn't run when they saw me coming, just stood there, swaying, watching me with those terrible eyes, and when I got close enough to see them clearly, his voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in his eyes, as fresh and raw as if the encounter had happened yesterday. "What did you see?" I pressed. "Their faces," he whispered. "Up close, you can see that they're not quite human. The proportions are all wrong, like someone tried to sculpt a person from memory but got the details mixed up. And their skin, it's not just pale, it's almost transparent. You can see things moving underneath, dark shapes that might be organs or might be something else entirely." The fog had grown so thick that the creatures were now completely obscured, but I could still feel their presence, pressing against the boundaries of perception like a weight on my chest. The air itself seemed to vibrate with their attention. "But that's not the worst part," the farmer continued. "The worst part is that they recognize you. Once you've seen them, really seen them, they know you. They start showing up in other places, at the edge of your property, in the shadows of your barn, sometimes even closer to the house." As if to emphasize his point, a pale form suddenly materialized at the edge of the fog, no more than 50 feet from the porch. It stood perfectly still, its yellow eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The creature was close enough that I could see the unnatural way its limbs were jointed, the way its chest rose and fell with breathing that seemed too slow, too deliberate. "That's the one that comes closest," the farmer said, his voice barely audible. "Been showing up every night for the past week. Just stands there watching the house. Sometimes I wake up and it's right outside my bedroom window, pressed against the glass like it's trying to get in." The creature began to move toward us, its gait fluid and unnatural. It didn't walk so much as flow, its feet barely touching the ground. With each step it seemed to grow more solid, more real, as if the fog itself was condensing into its pale form. We all stood up involuntarily, our chairs scraping against the wooden porch. The creature stopped about 20 feet away, just at the edge of the porch light's reach. In the pale glow I could see its face clearly for the first time, and the sight made my stomach turn. The features were human-like but wrong in every conceivable way. The eyes were too large, too bright, set in sockets that seemed to have been carved from bone. The nose was just a suggestion, two slits that flared and contracted with each breath. The mouth was a lipless gash that stretched almost from ear to ear, revealing not teeth but something that looked like rows of tiny sharp needles. But it was the expression on that terrible face that truly frightened me. It wasn't malevolent or hungry. It was curious, almost childlike in its intensity. The creature was studying us with the same fascination that a child might show when examining insects under a magnifying glass. "What does it want?" I whispered. The farmer's laugh was hollow, bitter. "That's the question, isn't it? What does any of them want? They don't attack, don't make any aggressive moves. They just watch and wait, like they're studying us for some purpose we can't understand." The creature tilted its head to one side, the movement sharp and bird-like. Then, without warning, it was gone. Not fled, not hidden, simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. The fog swirled in the space where it had stood, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw other forms moving in the mist. Dozens of them, all watching us with those terrible yellow eyes. "They're getting more active," the farmer said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Every year there are more of them, and they're getting braver, coming closer to civilization. Won't be long before other people start seeing them too." As if summoned by his words, the fog began to shift and swirl, and suddenly the creatures were everywhere. They emerged from the mist like ghosts materializing from the ether, their pale forms creating a semicircle around the farmhouse. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all swaying in unison, all watching us with those blazing yellow eyes. The air itself seemed to thicken with their presence, pressing against us like a physical weight. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, and my hands were slick with sweat despite the cool evening air. The creatures didn't move toward us, didn't make any threatening gestures, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "We need to leave," my friend whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own breathing. But as we turned to go, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. Among the pale forms surrounding the farmhouse, I saw one that was different from the others. It was larger, more substantial, and its eyes burned with a brighter, more intense light. And unlike the others, this one wasn't swaying. It stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed on me with an intelligence that was unmistakably malevolent. The creature opened its mouth, and for the first time, I heard one of them make a sound. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it carried clearly through the fog-laden air. A single word, spoken in a voice that was almost human, but wrong in every conceivable way. Soon, we ran then, abandoning the farmer to his vigil, fleeing into the night like children escaping from a nightmare. But as we drove away, I could see the creatures in the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the farmer's property, watching us disappear into the darkness. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the encounter at the farm had changed something fundamental. The creatures were no longer content to simply watch from the shadows. They were preparing for something, gathering their strength for some unknowable purpose. And we were running out of time to figure out what that purpose was. The weeks following our encounter at the farm passed in a haze of sleepless nights and growing dread. The creatures had become more aggressive, more visible, appearing not just in the fog-shrouded park, but in other locations around Shawnee. My friends and I began to piece together reports from other witnesses: a jogger who had seen glowing yellow eyes in the trees along the river trail, a night shift worker who had spotted pale forms moving through the fog in the industrial district, a police officer who had investigated reports of strange lights only to find himself face to face with something that defied explanation. The pattern was always the same. The creatures appeared on foggy nights, always watching, always just beyond the edge of complete visibility. They moved with that impossible speed, flowing through the mist like liquid shadows, and their eyes blazed with that sickly yellow light that seemed to burn itself into the retinas of anyone who saw them. But it was their behavior that truly disturbed me. They were no longer content to simply observe from a distance. Each sighting brought them closer to populated areas, closer to the warm lights of homes and businesses. They were learning, adapting, growing bolder with each passing night. The farmer's words haunted me. "They're getting more active. Every year there are more of them." But I was beginning to suspect that it wasn't just a matter of numbers. The creatures were changing, evolving, becoming something more than the passive observers they had once been. The first sign of this transformation came on a particularly foggy Thursday night. I was driving home from work, the familiar route made treacherous by the thick mist that had rolled in from the river. Visibility was down to mere feet, and I had to creep along at a crawl, my headlights barely penetrating the suffocating blanket of fog. That's when I saw them. They were standing in the middle of the road, a line of pale forms stretching across both lanes. Their eyes blazed like headlights in the darkness, and they stood perfectly still, perfectly silent, as if they were waiting for something. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. But the creatures didn't move. They simply stood there, watching me with those terrible yellow eyes. For a moment we stared at each other across the fog-shrouded asphalt. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, they began to move. But instead of flowing away into the mist as they had done before, they moved toward the car, their forms becoming more solid, more substantial with each step. I threw the car into reverse, but it was too late. They were already surrounding the vehicle, pressing against the windows with their pale, translucent faces. Up close, I could see details that made my stomach turn. Their skin was not just pale, it was luminescent, glowing with its own internal light. The veins beneath the surface were clearly visible, pulsing with some dark fluid that might have been blood, or might have been something far worse. Their eyes were the worst part. They were huge, far larger than any human eyes should be, and they seemed to see right through me, cataloging every thought, every fear, every memory. The yellow light that emanated from them was not steady but pulsing, like a heartbeat made of light. One of them pressed its face against the driver's side window, and I could see its mouth clearly for the first time. It was not a mouth at all, but a wound in the pale flesh, black and seemingly bottomless. As I watched in horror, it began to move, the edges rippling like water, and I realized it was trying to speak. No sound came out, but I could read the shape of the words on those terrible lips. "Come with us." I floored the accelerator, and the car shot backward through the fog. The creatures made no attempt to stop me, simply watching as I fled into the night. But as I drove away, I could see them in the rearview mirror, standing motionless in the road, their eyes burning like beacons in the darkness. The next morning, I called my friends and told them what had happened. They listened in stunned silence, and I could hear the fear in their voices when they responded. Similar encounters were becoming more common, they said. The creatures were no longer content to lurk in the shadows. They were making contact, trying to communicate. But what they wanted to communicate was the question that kept us all awake at night. The answer came 2 days later, when the fog rolled in thicker than ever before. It was a Saturday night, and despite our growing fear, we found ourselves drawn once again to the park by the river. We told ourselves we were being foolish, that we should stay away from the places where the creatures gathered. But the truth was that we were addicted to the fear, to the terrible thrill of standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. The fog was so thick that we could barely see our hands in front of our faces. The familiar landmarks of the park had disappeared entirely, replaced by a white void that seemed to stretch on forever. We moved slowly, carefully, our flashlights creating small pools of light in the endless darkness. That's when we heard them. It started as a whisper, so soft that we almost missed it. But gradually the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking in unison, creating a chorus of sound that seemed to come from the fog itself. We couldn't make out the words at first, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling to us, summoning us, drawing us deeper into the mist. The voices were hauntingly beautiful, almost musical, and I found myself taking a step forward before I realized what I was doing. "Don't listen to them," my friend whispered, grabbing my arm. "Whatever they're saying, don't listen." But it was too late. The voices had already wormed their way into our minds, and we could feel them tugging at our thoughts, our memories, our very souls. They were speaking in a language that was almost human but not quite, the words twisting and flowing like liquid music. As we stood there, transfixed by the sound, the fog began to part. A corridor of clear air opened before us, leading deeper into the park, deeper into the darkness. And there, at the far end of the corridor, we could see them. They were gathered in a vast circle, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Their pale forms seemed to glow in the darkness, and their eyes blazed like stars in a night sky. They stood perfectly still, perfectly silent, but I could feel their attention focused on us like a physical weight. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from the creatures themselves. They were singing, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. The song seemed to bypass our ears entirely, speaking directly to some primal part of our brains that understood meaning without words. And suddenly, I knew what they were saying. They were telling us their history, their purpose, their plan. They had been here long before humans arrived, dwelling in the spaces between reality and dream, feeding on fear and fascination. They had watched as our ancestors built their settlements along the river, had observed as we grew and multiplied and spread across the land. But something had changed. The barriers between their world and ours had begun to weaken, allowing them to manifest more fully in our reality. They were no longer content to simply observe from the shadows. They wanted to cross over entirely, to walk among us, to claim this world as their own. And we, the witnesses, the ones who had seen them and acknowledged their existence, were to be their ambassadors, their guides into the world of the living. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, and I staggered backward, breaking the spell that had held us transfixed. The corridor of clear air began to collapse, the fog rushing back in to fill the void, but the creatures were already moving, flowing toward us with that impossible speed, their eyes blazing with triumph. We turned and ran, crashing through the fog-shrouded park like blind men fleeing from a fire. Behind us, I could hear the chorus of voices growing louder, more jubilant, as if our flight was exactly what they had been waiting for. We reached the car and dove inside, our hands shaking as we started the engine. As we pulled away from the park, I caught one last glimpse of the creatures in the rearview mirror. They were standing at the edge of the parking area, no longer swaying, no longer passive. They stood like soldiers at attention, their eyes burning with purpose. The gathering storm was about to break, and we were caught in the eye of it. The creatures were preparing for something, marshaling their forces for some final push into our world. And we, the unwilling witnesses to their existence, were about to become players in a game whose rules we didn't understand. But one thing was clear. The time for passive observation was over. The creatures were coming, and they were bringing the fog with them. The fog came on the last night of October, rolling in from the Kansas River like a living thing. It was thicker than anything we had ever seen, a wall of white that swallowed the world whole. Streetlights disappeared into the mist, buildings became vague shadows, and the familiar streets of Shawnee transformed into an alien landscape where nothing was as it should be. I was at home when it started, watching the news and trying to pretend that everything was normal. But the fog was visible from my living room window, creeping across the landscape like a slow-motion avalanche. The meteorologist on television was calling it an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, but I knew better. This wasn't weather. This was something else entirely. My phone rang and I answered it without checking the caller ID. My friend's voice was tight with fear. "They're everywhere," he whispered. "The whole town is covered in fog, and they're moving through it like they own it. You need to get out of your house now." I looked out my window and felt my blood turn to ice. The fog had reached my neighborhood, and I could see shapes moving within it. Pale forms that glided through the mist with predatory grace. Their eyes blazed like yellow stars, and they were heading straight for the houses, straight for the warm lights where people huddled in their living rooms, oblivious to the danger approaching. "Where do we go?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The park," he said. "It's where this all started. If we're going to make a stand, it has to be there." I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but I was already too late. The fog had surrounded my house, and I could see them through the windows, dozens of pale figures standing in my yard, their eyes fixed on the house with that terrible intensity. They didn't move, didn't make any aggressive gestures, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I tried the back door, but they were there too, standing among the trees like sentinels. There was no escape, no way out except through them. Taking a deep breath, I opened the front door and stepped into the fog. The creatures parted before me like water, creating a corridor through their ranks. Up close, I could see that they had changed since our first encounter. They were more solid now, more present, as if the fog itself was giving them substance. Their skin still glowed with that pale luminescence, but it was brighter now, more vibrant. The veins beneath the surface pulsed with dark energy, and their eyes burned with an intensity that made it painful to look at them directly. One of them stepped forward, the large one I had seen at the farmer's house, the one that had spoken to us. It stood directly in front of me, blocking my path, and when it opened its mouth, its voice was clearer than before, almost human. "You understand now," it said, the words forming in the air like smoke. "You see what we are, what we have always been. The barriers are failing, and soon there will be no separation between your world and ours. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything except stand there and listen to that terrible voice. But I found myself frozen, transfixed by the creature's gaze. Its eyes were not just yellow, they were golden, like molten metal, and they seemed to see right through me to the very core of my being. "Why us?" I managed to whisper. "Why are you telling us this?" The creature's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Because you saw us first. Because you acknowledged our existence. In your world that has power. It creates connections." As it spoke, I became aware of a change in the fog around us. It was moving, swirling, forming patterns that were almost hypnotic. And within those patterns I could see glimpses of something else, another world, another reality, pressing against the boundaries of our own. "The crossing has begun," the creature continued. "Soon all the barriers will fall and we will walk freely in your world. But first we need guides, translators, those who can help us navigate the complexities of human existence." "We won't help you," I said, though my voice sounded weak and uncertain even to my own ears. The creature's smile widened. "You already have. Every time you saw us, every time you acknowledged our presence, you weakened the barriers. Your fear, your fascination, your desperate need to understand, it all feeds the crossing. You have been our unwitting servants from the very beginning." The fog began to thicken around us, and I could feel reality itself starting to shift and bend. The familiar streets of my neighborhood were fading, replaced by something altogether more alien. The houses became twisted, impossible structures that defied geometry and reason. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching toward a sky that was no longer quite the right color. "Welcome to our world," the creature said, its voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome to the space between spaces, the realm of the pale ones, the kingdom of the yellow eyes." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free from this nightmare. But my feet seemed rooted to the ground, and the fog pressed against me from all sides, thick and suffocating. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, my sense of self beginning to dissolve into the white void. But then through the fog I heard something unexpected. The sound of a car engine, growing louder by the second. The creatures turned toward the sound, their eyes blazing with anger and confusion. The fog began to part, and I saw my friend's car barreling through the mist, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin swords. "Get in!" my friend shouted, and I didn't hesitate. I dove into the car as it screeched to a halt, and we sped away from the creatures, away from the fog, away from the twisted landscape that had replaced my neighborhood. But as we drove, I could see in the rearview mirror that the fog was following us, spreading across the town like a living thing. The creatures moved within it, their forms becoming more solid, more real with each passing moment. They were no longer content to lurk in the shadows or stand passively in the mist. They were hunting, actively pursuing us through the fog-shrouded streets. We reached the park just as the fog began to thin, and we could see the creatures gathered there in vast numbers. They filled the entire clearing, standing in perfect formation, their eyes blazing like a constellation of malevolent stars. But something was different about them now. They were no longer the passive observers we had first encountered. They stood like an army, ready for battle, ready to claim this world as their own. The large creature, their leader, I realized, stepped forward from the ranks. When it spoke, its voice carried clearly through the fog, addressing not just us but the entire world. "The crossing is complete," it announced. "The barriers have fallen, and we are free to walk among you. Your world is now our world, and we will no longer hide in the shadows." As if to demonstrate its point, the fog began to lift, revealing the creatures in all their terrible glory. They stood in the pale moonlight, no longer translucent or spectral but solid and real. Their eyes burned with triumph, and their mouths curved in smiles that promised nothing but horror. But as the fog cleared, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. The park was no longer the familiar place we had known. The trees were wrong, twisted into impossible shapes. The river ran black under the moonlight, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy. This was no longer our world, it was theirs, and we were the intruders now. The creatures began to move, flowing out of the park and into the town beyond. They moved with purpose, with direction, no longer content to simply watch and wait. They were claiming their territory, marking it as their own, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. We sat in the car, paralyzed by the magnitude of what we had witnessed. The world as we knew it was ending, replaced by something alien and terrible. The creatures we had first seen swaying in the fog were now the masters of this new reality, and we were nothing more than witnesses to the apocalypse. But as I watched them spread across the landscape, I realized that our role in this nightmare was far from over. We were the ones who had seen them first, who had acknowledged their existence, who had inadvertently helped them cross over into our world. We were their unwitting servants, their guides into the realm of the living. And now, as the fog finally lifted and the creatures claimed their new domain, I understood that we would never be free of them. We were bound to them by something deeper than fear, something more primal than terror. We were part of their world now, just as they were part of ours. The crossing was complete, and there was no going back. The pale ones with their blazing yellow eyes had won, and the world would never be the same again. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of chaos beginning. Car alarms, screaming, the crackle of emergency radios. The rest of the world was just beginning to realize what had happened, but we had known for months. We had seen the signs, witnessed the preparations, watched as the barriers between worlds grew thin and finally shattered. And now, as the creatures spread across the landscape like a plague of pale shadows, I knew that our long nightmare was just beginning. The Watchers had become the watched, and we were all prisoners in a world that no longer belonged to us. The fog was gone, but the creatures remained, and they would never leave. They had found their new home, and we were going to have to learn to live with them, if we were lucky enough to survive that long. This wasn't some weekend camping trip. This was a hunt, and not for deer or elk. I was chasing something older, darker, and deadlier. The Gugui, a creature whispered about in ancient Native American legends, a dogman said to haunt these deep woods. The stories called it a shape-shifting hunter, more myth than fact, but I'd spent years hunting cryptids and I'd never walked away empty-handed, until now. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and scanned the thinning forest ahead. The thick pines bent in a cold wind, their branches creaking like bones. I could feel eyes on me, though I saw no movement. The first rule of survival out here was simple. Never let the fear control you. You're not just hunting a monster, I muttered under my breath. You're fighting your own mind. My breath fogged in the chill. Around me the woods whispered with secrets I wasn't ready for. The Gugui, they said, was more than a beast. It was cunning, stalking the hunter until the hunter became the hunted. I had studied old reports, scanned locals' fearful accounts, and gathered every scrap of evidence I could. Tonight, I was deep in the heart of the Kaibab National Forest, where sightings had spiked in recent weeks. Desperation in the air was palpable, and my gut told me I was close. I paused near a mossy rock and pulled out the motion sensor camera I'd set days ago. It had captured a shadow too fast to be human, and the prints nearby were wrong, too large, too sharp. As darkness fell, the forest's noises grew louder. Branches snapping, a low growl from somewhere unseen. I gripped my rifle tighter and whispered into the radio. "Base, do you copy? I'm moving toward the last sighting point." Static answered back. No reply. Just the raw pulse of the night and a distant howl that wasn't quite wolf. My heart hammered. I swallowed the rising fear, reminding myself of the stakes. This was about more than proof. It was about survival. Tonight I needed to face the Gugui, or be swallowed by the woods forever. Suddenly a rustle to my left sent me spinning, rifle raised. Eyes glinted in the moonlight. Though too low to be a deer, too bright to be an owl. It vanished before I could take aim, leaving only silence and the taste of cold dread. I set my jaw. "Whatever you are," I whispered, "I'm not afraid." But deep down, I knew the line between hunter and prey was thinner than ever. The Gugui was out here watching, waiting, and I was exactly where it wanted me. The night air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of pine needles and something more primal, something that clawed at the back of my mind. I crouched behind a fallen log, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The moon was a sliver, barely enough light to illuminate the dense forest floor. My breath came out in ragged puffs, and I struggled to keep my pulse steady. The Gugui wasn't just a legend here, it was a predator, and I was determined not to become its prey. I'd tracked the Gugui for 3 years now. It began after a hunting trip in northern Michigan went sideways. 3 experienced hunters disappeared without a trace. I was part of the search party that found what remained of their camp. Equipment scattered, tents shredded, and tracks in the soil unlike anything I'd ever seen. The authorities called it a bear attack. But bears don't drag 3 armed men into the night without leaving blood. Bears don't strategically disable radio equipment. And bears certainly don't leave 5-toed paw prints 14 inches long. That night changed everything for me. I'd been a wildlife photographer, comfortable in the outdoors but naive to its darkest secrets. After Michigan, I sold my studio, liquidated my savings, and dedicated myself to hunting what others dismissed as folklore. I studied with trackers, trained with ex-military scouts, and learned from indigenous elders who still respected the old stories enough to fear them. The Havasupai people of this region called it Wiapaya Gidjidialed, the one who walks like a man at night. American trappers in the 1800s had their own names for it. The shadow dog, the night stalker. Modern cryptozoologists settled on Gugwai, derived from a Paiute term meaning ghost wolf. Whatever its name, the pattern of its attacks remained consistent through centuries of scattered reports. It targeted those who ventured alone into its territory, especially hunters. It studied its prey before striking, and it left little evidence behind. I checked my watch. 9:45 p.m. The temperature had dropped to just above freezing. I needed to reach my observation blind before midnight. According to my research, the Gugwi was most active in the hours before dawn. My radio crackled suddenly, making me flinch. "Marcus, you copy?" The voice was broken, distorted by static and distance. Sarah, my research partner and only lifeline back to civilization. I pressed the transmit button. I copy, barely, signals weak. Storm front moving faster, expected. More static. Back to base camp, not safe. I looked up at the sky. Sure enough, clouds were gathering to the west, obscuring stars. The weather report had mentioned a possibility of snow, but not until tomorrow. Something was changing, and changing fast. Sarah, repeat last transmission. Are you telling me to return to base camp? I waited, but only static answered. The radio fell silent. Perfect. Communications compromised, weather turning, and miles of forest between me and safety. Classic horror movie setup. But I wasn't some hapless teenager wandering into the abandoned cabin. I was prepared. This was my element. At least that's what I told myself as I shouldered my pack and continued deeper into the wilderness. The path narrowed as the forest thickened. My headlamp illuminated only a small cone of visibility ahead. The darkness beyond it absolute and hungry. I stepped carefully, minimizing noise, though I suspected it knew exactly where I was. Another low growl echoed through the trees, closer this time. Instinctively, I switched off my headlamp. In the sudden darkness, my other senses heightened. The forest soundscape expanded. The whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant hooting of an owl, the soft crunch of something moving through underbrush 50 yards to my right, moving parallel to me, pacing me. I slowly raised my night vision monocular. Through its greenish glow, I scanned the trees. Nothing, but the sounds continued, perfectly matching my pace. Stop when I stopped, move when I moved. A twig snapped behind me. I spun, heart pounding, rifle at the ready. Empty forest greeted me. Whatever had been paralleling my path was now behind me. Circling, studying. I swallowed hard. "I know you're there," I said, my voice sounding thin in the vast darkness. "I've come a long way to find you." My words hung in the air, met only with the forest's indifferent silence. Then, a sound that froze my blood, a low rumbling chuckle, almost human but distorted, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Gugwi was toying with me. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Kaibab Plateau, gray light filtering through clouds heavy with unshed snow. I hadn't made it to my observation blind. After hours of being stalked through the darkness, I'd taken refuge in a rocky overhang, back against solid stone, watching the forest until exhaustion claimed me for a few fitful hours. My mouth tasted of copper and fear. I chewed a protein bar mechanically, washing it down with metallic-tasting water from my canteen. The radio remained silent despite my repeated attempts to contact Sarah. The storm had likely knocked out the repeater station we'd set up on the ridge. But I wasn't completely isolated. My satellite phone still functioned. though I hesitated to use it. Sarah and I had agreed, emergency contact only. Calling now would mean admitting defeat, aborting the expedition. After 3 years of searching, I wasn't ready to walk away, not when I was so close. Instead, I reviewed my evidence. The motion sensor cameras I'd placed throughout this section of forest over the past week had captured fragments of something unusual. Nothing clear enough for scientific validation, but compelling nonetheless. A tall shadow moving upright between trees, a reflection of eyes too high off the ground to belong to any known predator, a blur of motion too fast for the camera's shutter speed. Most telling were the tracks. A strange hybrid of canine and human characteristics. 5 distinct toes ending in sharp claws, a narrow heel, and a stride length of nearly 4 feet. I'd made plaster casts of the clearest prints, photographed others, and mapped their pattern through the forest. They showed intelligence. The Gugui avoided open areas, used stream beds to mask its trail, and occasionally doubled back to observe its own tracks, a behavior indicating self-awareness beyond normal animal cunning. The locals provided the final pieces. I'd spent months building trust in the small communities surrounding the national forest. At first, they were reluctant to speak with an outsider about the Gugui, but eventually the stories emerged. Livestock found mutilated in locked barns, hunters who never returned from solo expeditions, children who refused to sleep with their windows open even on the hottest summer nights because of what they'd seen watching from the tree line. One account particularly haunted me. Manuel Begay, an elderly Havasupai man, described an encounter from his youth. He'd been hunting deer alone when he felt watched. For hours, something tracked him through the forest. At dusk, he glimpsed it. Taller than a man but moving on all fours when needed, covered in dark fur, with a face that was almost a wolf, almost a man, but somehow wrong in ways that words can't capture. Manuel escaped by crossing a river, which the creature refused to follow. It could have caught me, he told me, his ancient hands trembling as he spoke. It wanted me to see it, to fear it, to tell others. I checked my GPS unit. My current position was less than 2 miles from where Manuel had his encounter 60 years ago. If the Gugui was territorial, as all evidence suggested, I was deep in its hunting grounds. The day warmed slightly as I broke camp, though the clouds continued to thicken. I needed to retrieve my remaining cameras before the storm hit. According to my map, the nearest one was half a mile northeast, placed near a natural game trail where I'd found unusual tracks a week earlier. The forest felt different in daylight, less immediately threatening, but somehow more watchful. Every sound seemed deliberate, every shadow potentially concealing eyes that studied my movements. I kept my rifle ready, though I questioned what good it would do if the stories were true. The Gugui was said to be nearly impossible to kill by conventional means, but I wasn't interested in killing it, only documenting it. Proving its existence would vindicate years of research and forever change our understanding of North American predators. At least that's what I told myself. But after last night, a more primal motivation was emerging: survival. This had become a contest of wills, of hunter versus hunter. If I fled now, I suspected the Gugui wouldn't simply let me leave its territory. Predators pursue fleeing prey. My only option was to face it on my terms, not its. I reached the first camera by mid-morning. The weatherproof case was intact, but when I opened it, I found the internal components crushed, the memory card missing. This wasn't environmental damage or equipment failure. Something had deliberately destroyed it. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I surveyed the area carefully, noting disturbances in the forest floor. Large prints circled the tree where the camera had been mounted, and claw marks scored the bark at a height of nearly 7 feet. The message was clear. It knew what I was doing. It was intelligent enough to recognize human technology and neutralize it. Moving more cautiously now, I continued to my second camera location. I found it similarly destroyed, but this time, the camera itself was missing entirely. Only the mounting strap remained, cleanly cut rather than torn. My third camera, this one concealed inside a hollow log near a watering hole, offered the first real evidence. Its memory card was intact, and when I reviewed the footage on my handheld viewer, my breath caught. The first 3 days showed normal forest activity: deer coming to drink, raccoons foraging, a family of elk passing through at dusk. On the fourth night at 2:17 a.m., all activity ceased. The smaller animals vanished first, followed by the deer, which bolted mid-drink, ears erect with alarm. For 20 minutes, the camera recorded an empty clearing bathed in moonlight. Then movement at the edge of the frame, something large, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for its size. It entered the clearing cautiously, first on all fours, then rising to a bipedal stance that put its height at well over 7 feet. The infrared illumination revealed a muscular form covered in dark fur, but its face remained in shadow as it turned, seemingly scanning the area. It approached the water, then suddenly froze. Its head turned directly toward the camera's hiding place. It knew. Somehow it sensed the camera inside the log. In 3 long strides it crossed the clearing, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. A massive hand, too long-fingered to be called a paw, reached toward the camera. The footage ended. My hands trembled as I pocketed the memory card. This was it. The first clear video evidence of the Googui. Not enough to see its face. Not enough to convince the most hardened skeptics. But more than anyone had captured before. If I could get this back to civilization, it would justify further expeditions, larger teams, better equipment. I was still staring at the blank viewer screen when I noticed the silence. The forest's ambient sounds, birds, insects, wind in the trees, had stopped. I wasn't alone. Slowly I raised my head, 20 yards away, partially concealed behind a massive ponderosa pine. Something watched me. I caught a glimpse of shaggy dark fur, a hint of reflected light from an eye. Not hiding, merely observing, letting me know I was seen. "I see you too," I said quietly, careful not to make sudden movements as I raised my rifle to a ready position. The shape behind the tree shifted slightly. A deep rumbling sound reached me. Not quite a growl, almost a chuckle. Then it was gone, melting into the forest with barely a sound despite its size. The encounter lasted less than 10 seconds, but it confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The Googui wasn't just hunting me, it was studying me, learning my patterns, perhaps even allowing me to gather evidence because it served some purpose of its own. As if on cue, fat snowflakes began to fall, slowly at first. Then more rapidly, the storm had arrived. I needed to reach shelter before conditions deteriorated further. My observation blind was still the best option, a reinforced structure built to withstand harsh weather, stocked with supplies for several days. I set off at a brisk pace, constantly scanning my surroundings. The snow thickened, reducing visibility and muffling sounds. Perfect conditions for an ambush predator. Perfect conditions for the Googui. It was out there, watching from the white void of the gathering storm. And night was coming. By late afternoon, the storm had transformed the forest into an alien landscape. 6 inches of snow blanketed the ground, bending pine boughs and obscuring landmarks. The temperature plummeted as darkness approached. My GPS still functioned, but progress was agonizingly slow as I waded through deepening drifts, the observation blind still over a mile away. My radio crackled unexpectedly, Sarah's voice breaking through in broken fragments. "Marcus, storm dangerous bears." I fumbled for the transmit button with gloved hands. "Sarah? You're breaking up. Say again." Tracks around base camp, not animals searching. Static consumed her next words, then coming to find. My blood ran cold. "Sarah, do not leave base camp. Repeat, stay at base camp." I shouted into the radio, but only static answered. Damn it. The last thing I needed was Sarah wandering into the forest looking for me. Base camp was relatively secure. Reinforced cabin walls, motion sensor lights, multiple escape routes. Out here in the storm, with visibility reduced to mere yards, she'd be helpless if the Googui found her. I checked my satellite phone, but the thickening storm clouds blocked the signal. I was on my own, and potentially responsible for putting Sarah in danger as well. I needed to reach the observation blind, fast. It was the highest point in the area, offering the best chance of re-establishing communications. The snow continued to fall as daylight faded. I switched on my headlamp, its beam creating a disorienting tunnel of swirling white. According to my GPS, I was still half a mile from the blind. At my current pace, fighting through snowdrifts now approaching my knees, it would take at least another hour. An hour I might not have. The forest had fallen eerily silent under its blanket of snow, but occasionally sounds reached me that didn't belong. A heavy footfall quickly muffled, branches cracking under substantial weight, once even what sounded like heavy breathing just beyond the range of my light. The Googui was paralleling my path again, using the storm as cover, perhaps waiting for exhaustion to slow me further. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a tree trunk. My legs burned from high-stepping through deep snow, and sweat dampened my base layers despite the cold. Not good. In these temperatures, wet clothing could lead to hypothermia quickly. I needed to regulate my pace, find the balance between speed and sustainability. As I stood there, I became aware of a peculiar sensation, a vibration through the soles of my boots. Rhythmic, regular, almost like footfalls. Something large, moving fast, approaching from behind. I spun, rifle raised, just as a massive shape burst from the swirling snow. My finger tightened on the trigger, but I checked myself at the last instant. Not the Gugui, a bull elk, running in blind panic, antlers lowered. It thundered past, missing me by inches, vanishing into the storm as quickly as it had appeared. Elks don't run like that without cause. Something had spooked it badly enough to send it charging through a blizzard at dusk. Something it feared more than the storm. I scanned the darkness behind me, seeing nothing but snow and shadows. Then, at the very edge of my headlamp's reach, a pair of eyes reflected the light, yellow-green, unblinking, at a height that could only belong to something standing upright. As I watched frozen, they blinked once, then disappeared. No more delaying. I turned and pushed forward with renewed urgency, no longer concerned about the noise I made. Speed was my only ally now. The GPS showed the observation blind less than quarter-mile ahead, up a gentle slope. I could make it. I had to make it. The terrain steepened. My legs protested each step, muscles trembling with fatigue. The cold bit at my exposed face, snow collecting on my eyebrows and lashes. But the blind was close now, 200 yards, 150. A howl cut through the storm, long, mournful, but ending in a series of barking sounds no wolf ever made. It came from ahead of me, between my position and the blind. The Gugui had cut me off. I stopped, desperately scanning for alternatives. According to my map, a rocky outcropping lay about 300 yards to the east. Not as secure as the blind, but better than open forest. I adjusted my course, moving as quickly and quietly as the snow allowed. The howl came again, closer this time, followed by that same chilling, almost human chuckle I'd heard the previous night. It was enjoying this. The storm, my isolation, my growing fear, all advantageous to a predator that knew these woods intimately and could see better in darkness than I could even with my headlamp. I reached the rocks as full darkness enveloped the forest. The outcropping formed a small cliff face about 15 feet high, with a shallow cave at its base. Not ideal, but the rock wall would protect my back, and I could monitor the single approach. I swept snow from the cave floor, set up my portable stove for heat, and established a defensive position facing outward. As the small flame pushed back the darkness and provided minimal warmth, I assessed my situation. The storm showed no signs of abating. My supplies would last 3 days if carefully rationed. The satellite phone remained useless under the cloud cover, and something intelligent, powerful, and hungry was stalking me through a wilderness, turned alien by snow and night. Hours passed. The wind rose, driving snow horizontally across the landscape. I fought to stay alert, but exhaustion clouded my mind. Twice I caught myself nodding off, jerking awake with my heart racing. The third time, I didn't wake until something scratched at the cave entrance. I bolted upright, rifle aimed into darkness. My stove had gone out, and with it my light source. I fumbled for my headlamp, switching it on with trembling fingers. The beam illuminated empty space. Snow had drifted into the cave entrance, unmarked by footprints or disturbances. Had I dreamed the scratching sound, hallucinated it in my exhausted state? Then my light caught it, a mark on the cave wall beside the entrance. 3 parallel grooves scored deep into the stone, fresh enough that rock dust still clung to the edges. Not a dream, not a hallucination. The Gugui had found my shelter, reached inside while I slept, and left its mark less than 2 feet from where I'd been sitting. The message was unmistakable. You are not safe. I can reach you whenever I choose. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Still hours until dawn, though in the storm, daylight would bring little advantage. I relit my stove with shaking hands, more for light than heat now. Sleep was no longer an option. I needed to remain vigilant, ready to defend myself when, not if, the Gugui returned. To keep myself awake, I reviewed what I knew about the creature. The indigenous stories described it as a night walker, a shapeshifter that could appear as man or wolf but was neither. Modern cryptozoologists speculated it might be an undiscovered species of Gigantopithecus or a relict population of dire wolves evolved for bipedal movement. Others suggested it was merely legend, a cultural memory of times when humans weren't the apex predator. But the evidence I'd gathered pointed to something more complex. The Gugui showed problem-solving intelligence, strategic thinking, and what appeared to be psychological warfare tactics. It destroyed cameras, tracked humans across difficult terrain, and deliberately revealed itself in ways designed to induce maximum fear. No known animal behaved this way. A sound outside pulled me from my thoughts. Soft footfalls in snow, methodical and deliberate. I raised my rifle, sighting down the barrel toward the cave entrance. The footsteps circled my position, first left, then right, then directly above on the rock overhang. Pebbles and dirt showered down as something heavy shifted its weight on the cliff above me. Then silence, complete and absolute. Minutes stretched painfully as I waited, every muscle tense, ears straining for any sound. Nothing came. Eventually, I allowed myself to lower the rifle slightly, though I kept it ready. A mistake. In one fluid motion, something massive dropped from the overhang, momentarily blocking the cave entrance. Before I could react, a long, powerful arm reached inside, swiping at my position. Claws raked across my left shoulder, slicing through parka and flesh alike. I cried out, squeezing the trigger reflexively. The rifle's report was deafening in the confined space. The creature withdrew instantly, a high-pitched yelp suggesting I'd scored a hit. I scrambled to the back of the cave, pressing my hand against my wounded shoulder. Warm blood seeped between my fingers. Not arterial, but deep enough to be serious without treatment. Outside, I heard heavy breathing, then a low growl that transitioned into that same horrible chuckling sound. Injured, but not severely. Testing me again. Learning my responses. "Come on then," I shouted, anger temporarily overcoming fear. "Finish it." Only the wind answered. The Gugui had withdrawn, but I knew it remained nearby, watching, waiting. This had been another test, another move in its psychological game. It could have killed me in that moment of surprise, but chose instead to wound and retreat. Why? The realization came with chilling clarity. It was prolonging the hunt, enjoying my fear, playing with its food. Blood loss and adrenaline crash left me lightheaded. I needed to treat my wound, but my first aid kit was in my pack, dropped near the cave entrance when I'd first arrived. To reach it, I'd have to move closer to where the Gugui had just been. No choice. Keeping my rifle trained on the entrance with one hand, I inched forward until I could drag the pack toward me with my foot. The first aid kit contained butterfly bandages, antiseptic and pain relievers. Enough for basic treatment, not enough for a serious injury. I cleaned and dressed the wound as best I could, then swallowed 2 painkillers dry. Dawn was still hours away. The storm continued unabated, howling across the landscape like a living thing. Inside my rocky shelter, I prepared for a long night of vigilance, knowing sleep was no longer an option. The Gugui was done playing games. The next encounter would be decisive. One way or another, the hunt would end before the next sunset. First light brought little relief. A grayish illumination diffused through still falling snow. I'd survived the night through a combination of vigilance and luck. Though my wounded shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, the bleeding had stopped, but infection remained a serious concern in these conditions. Outside my shelter, the storm had transformed the forest into a white wasteland. Snowdrifts piled against trees, obscuring the landscape and reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. My hopes of reaching either the observation blind or base camp seemed increasingly futile. Even with snowshoes, travel would be dangerously slow, and the Gugui clearly held the advantage in these conditions. My radio and satellite phone remained useless. I was effectively cut off from the outside world, wounded, with dwindling supplies. And somewhere out there the creature waited, perhaps nursing its own injury from my lucky shot. I studied the cave entrance, looking for signs of the Gugui's return during the brief periods when exhaustion had overcome my vigilance. Fresh scratches marked the stone near the opening. Not aggressive claw marks, but deliberate, almost artistic patterns. 3 parallel lines crossed by a 4th. The same design repeated at different heights. A signature, a warning, Some form of primitive communication? As I pondered this, a sound reached me through the wind, faint but unmistakable. A human voice calling my name. Marcus. Marcus, can you hear me? Sarah. My heart sank. Despite my warnings, she'd left base camp to search for me. Now she was out in the open, exposed, calling attention to herself in territory the Gugui considered its own. I scrambled to the cave entrance. Sarah, I shouted as loudly as my parched throat allowed. I'm here. Stop where you are. Her voice came again, closer but muffled by the wind. Marcus, is that you? Stop moving, I called. Stay where you are. I'll come to you. I gathered my essential gear rapidly. Rifle, ammunition, first aid kit, water, emergency flares. My injured shoulder protested as I slung my pack, but adrenaline dulled the pain. Sarah was in immediate danger. The Gugui had proven its hunting abilities in normal conditions. In this snowstorm, tracking a human unfamiliar with the terrain would be trivial for it. I pushed through the snow, following Sarah's voice. She continued calling periodically, allowing me to navigate toward her position. The wind shifted, momentarily clearing visibility. I spotted her approximately 100 yards ahead, a small figure in bright red snow gear, standing exposed on a fallen log to gain elevation. Sarah, I waved frantically. Get down, it's not safe. She turned toward me, relief visible even at this distance. She waved back, starting to climb down from her perch. That's when I saw it. Movement behind her. A dark shape against the white landscape, moving with terrifying speed on all fours. The Gugui, using my distraction as the perfect moment to strike. Behind you, I screamed, breaking into a run despite the deep snow. Sarah, run, now. She turned, saw the approaching predator, and froze momentarily in shock. That hesitation nearly cost her life. The Gugui launched itself in a powerful leap that would have taken her down if she hadn't finally reacted, diving sideways into a snowdrift as the creature sailed over her position. I raised my rifle, struggling to aim while running. The creature landed, spun with impossible agility, and focused on Sarah as she scrambled backward in the snow. I had seconds, at most. I fired. The shot went wide, but accomplished what I needed, diverting the Gugui's attention from Sarah to me. Its head swung in my direction, and I got my first clear look at what we'd been hunting all these years. The face was a nightmarish hybrid, elongated muzzle filled with gleaming teeth, eyes intelligent and calculating, set in a skull structure too humanoid to belong to any known animal. Its body combined the worst aspects of wolf and man, powerful shoulders and arms ending in hand-like paws with opposable thumbs and vicious claws, digigrade legs built for explosive speed and power. Dark fur covered its form, matted with ice and snow. Blood darkened the fur on its right flank, where my shot from the previous night had found its mark. For a moment, hunter and hunted locked eyes across 50 yards of snow-covered ground. In that gaze, I recognized something beyond animal instinct. Awareness, assessment, decision. The Gugui knew what my rifle could do. It knew I stood between it and the easier prey. It made its choice. It charged straight at me. I had time for one more shot before it closed the distance. I aimed for center mass, squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck, staggering the creature momentarily, but it recovered with frightening speed, resuming its charge with only slightly diminished velocity. No time to chamber another round. I dropped the rifle and drew my sidearm, a .44 Magnum that I'd always considered excessive until this moment. I fired twice in rapid succession as the Gugui covered the final distance between us in a blur of motion. The impact felt like being hit by a truck. We went down together in the snow, its weight crushing the breath from my lungs, claws raking at my chest and arms as I struggled to keep its snapping jaws from my throat. The stench of its breath, copper and rot, and something chemical I couldn't identify, filled my nostrils as saliva dripped onto my face. In desperate close-quarters combat, training took over. I managed to press the barrel of my sidearm against the creature's abdomen and pulled the trigger. The report was muffled by its body. The Gugui howled, a sound that began as animal pain but shifted hideously into something almost human. It recoiled, giving me the separation I needed. I scrambled backward, firing my remaining rounds. 2 missed in my panic, but the third caught the creature in the shoulder, spinning it halfway around. It recovered with that same unnatural speed, but instead of pressing the attack, it retreated several paces, eyeing me with what could only be described as calculation. Blood matted its fur in several places, but none of the wounds appeared immediately fatal. It was injured, perhaps seriously, but far from incapacitated. I was out of ammunition for my sidearm, separated from my rifle, bleeding from multiple lacerations. Sarah was somewhere behind me, hopefully using this confrontation as an opportunity to find cover. The Gugui and I circled each other in the blood-spattered snow. My mind raced through options, none promising. My pack contained a hunting knife, practically useless against this opponent, a flare gun, potentially disorienting but unlikely to cause serious damage, a canister of bear spray, effective range too short for comfort. The bear spray. It was my only chance. Slowly I reached for my pack, maintaining eye contact with the creature. It tracked my movements, muscles tensing as if preparing for another charge. I unzipped the outer pocket with deliberate care, fingers closing around the canister. The Gugui's posture changed subtly. It recognized a weapon when it saw one, understood my intention. Before I could raise the spray, it launched into motion, not directly at me, but circling to my wounded left side, looking for weakness. I pivoted, trying to keep it in front of me, but my injured shoulder slowed my reaction. The creature feinted right, then darted left, faster than anything its size should move. Claws raked my side as it passed, opening fresh wounds. I stumbled but kept my feet, managing to discharge a cloud of spray in its general direction. The capsaicin hit its mark. The Gugui recoiled, pawing at its eyes and muzzle, emitting a high-pitched keening sound that pierced the air. I used the momentary advantage to retrieve my rifle, chambering a fresh round with hands slick with my own blood. "Marcus," Sarah's voice, closer than expected. She'd circled behind me, armed with the flare gun from her own pack. "On three." I understood her plan immediately. "Three," I shouted, dropping to one knee to stabilize my aim. Sarah fired the flare. It arced through the air, a streaking red star that struck the ground near the Gugui, illuminating the scene with crimson light and filling the air with smoke. The sudden brightness and chemical smell further disoriented the already suffering creature. It reared back, exposing its chest and throat. I took the shot. The bullet struck true. The Gugui staggered, a wet gurgling sound replacing its howls. It took 2 faltering steps toward me, eyes burning with hatred and something else. Recognition, perhaps. A final acknowledgement between predators. Then its legs buckled, and it collapsed into the blood-stained snow. Sarah was beside me suddenly, supporting my weight as adrenaline ebbed, bringing with it awareness of my injuries. "Is it dead?" she asked, voice trembling. "Don't know," I managed. "Can't take chances." Together we approached the fallen creature cautiously. It lay motionless, blood pooling beneath its massive form. Up close, its dimensions were even more impressive. Nearly 8 feet from snout to tail, with limbs powerfully muscled beneath its shaggy coat. I prodded it with my rifle barrel. No response. "We need to document this," I said, fumbling for my camera despite my injuries. "No one will believe." A sound interrupted me. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors, growing louder by the second. Sarah looked up, eyes wide. "The emergency beacon," she said. "I activated it when I left base camp. They must have picked up the signal when the storm cleared." I glanced skyward. She was right. The snowfall had finally stopped. Patches of blue visible between thinning clouds. Perfect timing for rescue. Terrible timing for documentation. By the time we convinced authorities to return to this spot, the storm would have covered all evidence, including the Gugui's body. "Quick," I said, pulling my pack camera free with bloodied fingers. "Take pictures. Everything. The body, the tracks, the blood patterns, the bullet wounds, its face, everything." Sarah worked rapidly, documenting the scene from multiple angles while I fought to remain conscious. Blood loss and exposure were taking their toll. As darkness crept into the edges of my vision, I found myself staring into the Gugui's eyes, still open, still somehow aware even in death. A worthy adversary, a creature science had failed to acknowledge despite centuries of evidence. The helicopter appeared overhead, hovering as it sought a landing zone in the forest clearing. 2 rescue paramedics rappelled down, rushing to assess our conditions. Their shouts seemed distant, underwater, I tried to direct their attention to the creature's body, but words failed me as consciousness slipped away. My last thought before darkness claimed me: would anyone believe what we'd found? Or would the Gugui remain legend, despite the evidence lying in blood-soaked snow? I awoke to the sterile white of a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors replacing the howl of wind through pines. An IV dripped fluids and antibiotics into my arm. Bandages covered my shoulder, chest, and side where the Gugui's claws had opened my flesh. According to the attending physician, I'd received over 60 stitches, narrowly avoided infection that would have cost me the arm, and lost enough blood to require 2 transfusions. Sarah sat beside my bed. Her own injuries minor by comparison: frostbite on 2 fingers, a sprained ankle from her dive into the snowdrift, and a shallow claw mark across her calf. She squeezed my hand when she saw I was awake. "The photos?" I asked immediately, voice raspy from disuse. Her expression told me everything before she spoke. "Gone. The camera was damaged in the fight. The memory card was corrupted. Everything we documented at the scene, lost." Of course, it couldn't be that easy. The Gugui had evaded scientific discovery for centuries. It wouldn't surrender its secrets even in death. The body? I already knew the answer, but needed to hear it. By the time the rescue team stabilized you enough for transport, a second storm front was moving in. They refused to delay evacuation for what they called wildlife documentation. When I tried to explain what we'd found, she trailed off, shaking her head. They assumed it was a bear or wolf, possibly rabid. Said Fish and Wildlife would investigate after the weather cleared. And did they? 3 days later, found nothing but disturbed snow and traces of blood. Both yours and something else. They took samples, but without context. It'll be classified as unknown predator, possibly a bear. The storm covered everything else. I closed my eyes, frustration burning in my chest more painfully than my wounds. So close. After years of searching, I'd finally confronted the Gugui, confirmed its existence beyond any personal doubt, even killed one, and had nothing to show for it. No body, no clear photographs, no definitive evidence. "What about the motion sensor footage?" I asked. "From the third camera?" Sarah's expression brightened slightly. "That we still have. It's not much. Just a few seconds of something large moving at the edge of the frame. Nothing that would convince a skeptic. But it matches your description." She hesitated. "There's something else. The blood samples you collected earlier in the expedition, from those scratches on the trees, the lab results came back." I sat up straighter despite the pain. "And inconclusive. DNA structure similar to Canis lupus, but with significant unexplained variations. The lab wants more samples before making definitive statements, but their preliminary report mentions potential unknown canid subspecies. A thin thread of validation, but better than nothing. The scientific community wouldn't accept potential unknown canid subspecies as proof of the Gugui, but it opened a door for further research. If I could secure funding for another expedition, with better equipment, a larger team. "There's more," Sarah said, interrupting my thoughts. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a curved object, approximately 4 inches long. A claw. I managed to hide this before the paramedics arrived. Thought you should be the first to examine it. I took the bag with trembling hands. The claw was unlike anything in scientific literature. Too large for wolf, too curved for bear. With a serrated inner edge more reminiscent of raptor talons than mammalian claws. At its base, tissue remained where it had torn free during our struggle, potentially containing DNA that would complement the blood samples. "This changes everything," I whispered, turning the claw in the light. "With this, we can prove—" A knock at the door interrupted me. A man in a dark suit entered without waiting for a response, followed by a woman in similar attire. Both carried themselves with the unmistakable posture of government authority. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said, not a question. "I'm Agent Carver. This is Agent Lowell. We'd like to ask you some questions about the incident in Kaibab National Forest." Sarah discreetly slipped the evidence bag into her pocket as the agents approached. Their timing seemed suspiciously convenient. "You've come a long way just to interview a wildlife photographer about a hiking accident," I said carefully. Agent Lowell smiled thinly. "Is that what you believe happened? A hiking accident? What else would it be?" I maintained eye contact, conscious of Sarah's tension beside me. Agent Carver consulted a small notebook. The paramedics reported that you were both in shock, making statements about a dogman or wolfman that attacked you. You specifically used the term googie repeatedly during transport. Trauma and blood loss can cause hallucinations, I replied. I'm sure that's noted in their medical report as well. Indeed. Carver's expression remained neutral. However, this isn't the first incident of this nature in the region. We've been monitoring unusual predator activity in several national forests for some time. This was unexpected. I exchanged glances with Sarah before carefully asking, what kind of unusual predator activity? That's classified, Agent Lowell interjected. What we can tell you is that your description matches other reports we've received. We're particularly interested in any evidence you might have collected. Photographs, tissue samples, tracks. They knew. Somehow, they knew exactly what we'd been hunting, perhaps had known all along. The implication was staggering. A government agency tracking cryptid activity, keeping it classified rather than informing the public or scientific community. All our equipment was damaged in the storm, Sarah said smoothly. As I told the rescue team, we were studying conventional predator patterns when we were attacked by what we believe was a diseased wolf or bear. The agents exchanged looks. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Chen, Carver said finally. We're not here to dispute your findings or confiscate your research. Quite the opposite. We represent a specialized division tasked with investigating unconventional wildlife encounters. Your expertise could be valuable to our ongoing studies. He placed a business card on the bedside table. When you're recovered, we'd like to discuss a potential consultation arrangement. Confidential, of course, but well compensated. In the meantime, his eyes flicked to Sarah's pocket where the claw was hidden. We'd appreciate your discretion regarding any unusual specimens you may have acquired. They left as abruptly as they'd arrived, leaving questions hanging in the sterile air. Sarah withdrew the claw from her pocket, examining it with new weariness. What do we do? She asked quietly. I considered our options. The agent's visit confirmed something I'd long suspected. The Gugwai wasn't unknown to authorities. Its existence had been deliberately kept from public knowledge, classified like so many other inconvenient truths. But why? Protection of natural resources, national security, something darker. We continue our research, I said finally, but carefully. We document everything in duplicate, store evidence in multiple secure locations, and we consider their offer, not because I trust them, but because it might give us access to information we couldn't obtain otherwise. Sarah nodded slowly. And the claw? We get it tested privately, multiple labs, under different pretexts, compare results, build our case methodically until the evidence is too compelling to dismiss or classify. The truth about the Gugwai wouldn't remain buried forever. Perhaps it had chosen me as much as I had chosen to hunt it, recognized in me the persistence necessary to bring its existence into the light after centuries of shadow. Our confrontation in the snowy forest hadn't been an ending, but a beginning. As darkness fell outside my hospital window, I found myself listening for sounds beyond the building's ambient noise. The soft padding of inhuman feet, the low chuckle that was neither man nor beast. The Gugwi I'd killed had been one specimen of an unknown number. Its kind still roamed the deep wilderness, hunting, watching, waiting. And somewhere in the vast forests of North America, others like it were studying humans just as we studied them, learning our patterns, testing our defenses, selecting which of us would make suitable prey. I touched my bandaged shoulder, feeling the ache of wounds that would eventually heal into scars, permanent reminders of a truth most would never believe. The business card sat on my bedside table, its government seal catching the light, a door to answers perhaps, or to deeper mysteries. Either way, the hunt would continue. The Gugwi had revealed itself to me, and I to it. Our species were now locked in a dance of discovery and concealment that stretched back to prehistory. Predator studying predator across the narrowing wilderness between civilization and the ancient dark, and I would be ready when our paths crossed again.